Hello everyone. If you are new to my channel, then consider liking and subscribing. It will make me feel wonderful if you do it, thanks. By the way, I also have a Luffy fan fiction channel. If you are interested, the link is in the description. Doomed to Repeat by Fiachra Ochiern. 1 year after Jiraiya's death, Naruto is no longer the ninja he once was. Faced with the chance to change everything that went wrong, can Naruto rise above the strength of his enemies, the suspicions of his friends, and most of all, his own weaknesses? I don't own anything. Now let's get started.
That's not a kick-ass jutsu, the blonde complained as he jumped over a small puddle in the road to avoid getting his feet wet. Ha! Keiru laughed loudly and stowed his hands back in his pockets. You have no idea. If everything worked out well, Kage Bunshin no Jutsu would once again become Naruto's strongest technique. It was how he had learned Rasengan, how he had come up with the Fuden, Ransenshuriken, and it was the only way he had any allies in his later fights. With him, a one-on-one fight could suddenly become a one-on-100 fight. Keiru was about to explain the many benefits of Kage Bunshin to Naruto when a thought suddenly connected in his mind with all the force of getting zapped with a rakery. Small puddle. Middle of road. Cloudless sky. Keiru stopped walking and spun around to face Kakashi suddenly. But the Junin's eye looked as lazy and unconcerned as ever. Keiru frowned first at Kakashi, then at the puddle that now lay behind the party. Something wrong, Keiru-kun? Kakashi asked innocently. Keiru turned his confused eyes from Kakashi to Sasuke. Something had happened. He knew something was supposed to happen, but he couldn't remember what. Something had happened before they had first encountered Zabuza. Something with Sasuke involved. Great, another dobi, sneered Sasuke when Keiru's gaze remained fixed on the Uchiha. Are you hurt, scaredy cat? Wide-eyed, Keiru saw Naruto jump in front of him and open his mouth to defend his cousin, or to curse out Sasuke at the top of his lungs, but probably both. Beyond the squabbling boys, Sakura scowled at the scene while Tazuna looked at the boys hopelessly. Kakashi was just smiling as if everything was as it should be. As if he didn't notice the two heads rising from the puddles behind him. Don't! Keiru suddenly snapped and grabbed Naruto's collar with one hand, jerking him back to his side. Naruto turned his scowl up to the taller boy before he froze suddenly. Keiru ignored Naruto's fright and watched as a chain flew up from the strange puddles and wrapped around Kakashi as his genin looked on in shock. Keiru thrust his hand into the holster strapped to his leg and fingered two kunai. But as the shinobi wearing Kirihide 8 and strange masks over their noses and mouths emerged fully from their hiding places, Keiru felt an inexplicable reassurance. Kakashi didn't die here. He would never die to shinobi stupid enough to hide in a puddle when there hadn't been any rain in days. So when Kakashi's body was torn to pieces by the chain that stretched between the Kiri shinobi, Keiru was the only who didn't cry out. Kakashi-sensei! Shouted Naruto in a mix of desperation and disbelief. What? Sakura's cry was sheer panic. Even Sasuke allowed himself a surprised grunt and turned his attention exclusively on the confident shinobi. One down, whispered one of the Kiri ninja. The chain whipped through the air between the dark-haired enemy nin as they turned to their next target. Keiru brought out a single kunai and took in the scene quickly. He saw one of the shinobi's gaze flicker towards him briefly. They probably thought he was more of a threat, being older. But they kept with their original target and went straight for Tazuna. Stay back, sir, Sakura ordered as she shakily drew a kunai and prepared to meet the coming attack. Sakura-chan! Naruto cried once he realized what was happening, but Sasuke was faster. Suddenly, the Kiri nin found their weapon pinned to a tree with one of Sasuke's kunai. The short genin gave an almighty leap and planted his foot in the side of the nin's head. One to go, muttered Keiru from the other nin's side. He gritted his teeth and plunged his kunai into the man's chest. Unfortunately, Sasuke's kick forced the nin's compatriot to smash his head against his partner's. The force of the blow was enough to jerk Keiru's opponent closer to him and cause the kunai to slice through the man's arm instead of his heart as originally intended. Keiru grimaced at the mess. The brats were going to have to work on their teamwork. Keiru's opponent stumbled backwards, dropping his end of the chain to clutch at his new wound. His comrade lay sprawled on the road, blacked out from the force of a heel to his temple. Well, at least Keiru didn't have to kill him. He took up a position directly in front of Sakura with Sasuke at his right. A huff panting and a glimpse of orange from the corner of his eye told him that Naruto had come around to his left. Keiru smirked triumphantly at the single opponent. Now, they looked like a team. Bastard! Naruto shouted accusingly. Who the hell are you? Step aside, kiddies, sneered the ninja. His voice sounded muffled and slightly distorted from beneath the bulky mask that he wore. And maybe you'll get out of this alive. Like hell. Keiru gripped Naruto's shoulder silently, his fingers digging into the familiar orange jumpsuit that covered the bony shoulder. Something was wrong. The battle shouldn't be lasting this long. Where the heck was Kakashi? Chapter 9. Kakashi crouched on the tree branch he had found for his perch and studied the battle below him with an intensity born of living through 3 years of war and 7 years of anbu duties. Thus far, his students were winning. Not that such a revelation surprised Kakashi. Whoever the two ninja from Kiri were, they couldn't be of a very high rank. Sasuke and Keiru's combined efforts had already rendered one of them unconscious, and the other was simply staring warily at the ginger ninja in front of him. "Sakura," Keiru called without taking his eyes off the Kiri nin. "Keep your position. There might be more. Sasuke, make sure the guy doesn't get up." Kakashi noted the commanding tone of Keiru's voice as well as the way his own students were obeying the redhead. It could have been simply because Keiru was now the oldest and supposedly the most experienced of the team. But that didn't explain how Keiru had fallen into a leadership role so easily. He claimed that he had been wandering alone, without companions, for years. He wouldn't have needed to know how to work on a team, much less how to lead one. As Sasuke knelt to bind the unconscious Kiri nin with a length of rope, Keiru and Naruto faced down the last opponent. Kakashi wondered if this was part of Keiru's strategy. He knew that Keiru had been teaching Naruto, as both Ebisu and the anbu that watched the boy when Keiru was off duty had reported. But the older genin hadn't done much with taijutsu other than that fight that Kakashi had walked in on, and that was against Sasuke, not Naruto. Either way, Kakashi had a perfect opportunity to observe Uzumaki in combat, and he wasn't going to come out until he was good and ready. Keiru flipped a kunai into his hand and glared at the enemy. He flicked the weapon at the man's head, but the Kiri nin dodged the projectile easily, making Kakashi think that the kunai wasn't meant for anything other than to get the ninja moving. In response, the Kiri nin charged for his two opponents and extended his uninjured arm, the one that was encased in a thick gauntlet that ended in a cruel-looking set of claws. Knowing Kirikuger's fascination with assassinations, Kakashi guessed that the claws were poisonous as well. "Naruto, left!" Keiru suddenly shouted. Obedient to the call, Naruto launched himself to the left as Keiru took off towards his right. With his two targets splitting up, the Kiri nin was forced to make a choice. He apparently decided that the older shinobi would also be the most dangerous and curved his weapon-clad arm to his right, chasing after Keiru. Keiru waited until the last minute then let his body fall backwards. He caught himself with one hand planted firmly on the ground as the claws sailed over his head. As one leg swept towards the shinobi's leg, Keiru grabbed the man's armor-covered arm and twisted hard. The force of the pull carried the masked shinobi into Keiru's kick, forcing Keiru's foot to connect with the side of his enemy's knee, while, at the same time, Naruto leapt above the ground and drove his heel into the other side of the targeted knee. The Kiri nin suddenly found his knee caught in a vice of two vicious kicks. The Kiri nin cried out in pain. One of his arms was now dripping blood, and Kakashi wouldn't have been surprised if the patella was completely shattered. It was impressive that Naruto, whether through instinct, observation, or simply training with his cousin, had aimed for the same place as Keiru had. In a way, Naruto and Keiru made as impressive a team as Keiru did with his clones. However, with the Kiri nin kneeling in the center of the road while Keiru and Naruto stood over him, the battle was decidedly over. Kakashi wasn't going to see any more. "Are there others?" Keiru suddenly demanded of the bleeding ninja. His voice was hard and cold and left Kakashi in no doubt that Keiru had lived through enough missions to know how to guarantee information from a captured enemy. "A true Kiri shinobi never gives up anything to the enemy," declared the dark-haired man who had just been trying to kill them. Keiru pulled back a kunai and held it backwards, with the point facing his wrist as the blunt end served as the main weapon. He swung the weapon hard against the man's temple, no doubt trying for physical intimidation. However, Keiru seemed to misjudge either the power of his own blow or fortitude of the Kiri nin. The dark man's eyes rolled back in his head, and he slumped forward into unconsciousness. Keiru simply stared at his handiwork, confused, and blinked twice before he recovered. "Shit," he swore in frustration. Kakashi supposed that this was as good a time as any to reappear. Besides, he needed to keep someone alive to answer his questions. "Really, Keiru-kun, is that any kind of language to use around children?" he asked with a happy lilt as he jumped out of the tree and reappeared in the road behind Keiru. "Kakashi-sensei," Sakura cried in obvious relief. Facing Keiru's back, Kakashi could see Naruto's face brighten obviously at the sight of his sensei. Keiru just folded his arms across his chest and turned with an annoyed look on his face. "Took y'all long enough," Keiru muttered. "You couldn't have come out before the two guys decided to attack your students?" The fact that Keiru wasn't surprised to see the Junin could mean that he had sensed Kakashi's presence in the tree. Then again, the short, stout logs that dotted the road instead of Kakashi's guts were a pretty obvious hint as well. "Well, you seem to have a pretty good handle on the situation," Kakashi responded easily. It was easy by now to play the part of a lazy ass who wanted to get out of as much work as possible. As long as he kept people's expectations of him low, he had a better chance of surprising them should they ever turn out to be his enemies. Kakashi glanced around to take stock of their situation. Sakura stood in front of Tazuna, still slightly tense from the battle. Sasuke, on the other hand, seemed completely calm. The unconscious Kiri-nin had his hands tied behind his back with Sasuke's foot pinning his face to the ground. Naruto was bouncing slightly on his heels. The boy's endless energy would probably come in handy in battle if he ever learned the proper way to utilize it. "How did you know their intentions?" inquired Kakashi suddenly. "What kind of shinobi hides in a puddle when it hasn't rained for 3 days?" Kaoru rolled his eyes. Kakashi lifted his eyebrows slightly in interest. That would explain Kaoru's sudden nervousness right before the attack. He had sensed something out of the ordinary, but it was strange that he hadn't come to the right conclusion until after the attack had started, and he had immediately gone to protect Naruto. Sasuke suddenly drew a kunai and positioned it threateningly at his unconscious captive's throat, just next to his jugular. "Don't bother, Sasuke." Kakashi waved one hand lazily. A sleeping man couldn't answer any of their questions. A civilian, though, was far easier to intimidate. "We have another source of information," Kakashi announced as he advanced onto Tazuna with a friendly smile that didn't match his tone of voice. Apparently, Tazuna-san does not think it is dangerous to lie to shinobi about the potential enemies they face. Tazuna's eyes widened as his throat worked convulsively. "This has now become a B-ranked mission," noted Kakashi, pleased at the obvious nervousness that Tazuna displayed. But the bridge builder was not the only one contributing to the increasing tension in the air surrounding the small genin team and their client. Kakashi's single eye traveled calmly to where Kaoru stood in the middle of the road. The redhead's expression was impassive, but Kakashi could feel the nervous energy radiating from him. It could have been the adrenaline left over from the battle, but Kakashi wanted the opportunity to make sure. And if he could sweat out Tazuna at the same time, he considered it a good plan. Kaoru took a deep breath and curled his hands into fists to conceal the fact that they were shaking. He could have symptoms of adrenaline working its way out of his system, but it hadn't been that big of a fight. Truthfully, his shaking could probably be only half blamed on adrenaline. The rest of it was anger, both at Kakashi for taking so long and at himself for knocking out the Kiri-nin when he hadn't meant to. Kaoru sighed and took several deep breaths through his nose as he watched Naruto shot a triumphant grin at Sasuke, who was still holding down the down-and-out ninja from mist. "The best thing would be to return to Konoha," announced Kakashi. Kaoru's eyes snapped up in surprise at Kakashi. He hadn't really been paying attention to Kakashi's mutterings, assuming that Kakashi would do the same thing he had always done and continue with the mission because anyone who had been training under namikaze Minato was simply too noble to let people down who needed help. "What?" Kaoru snapped, his eyes flashing as he faced the Junin. He knew it was probably a mistake to challenge Kakashi, especially when he was angry. Kakashi still thought Kaoru was a spy, or at least an unknown. He couldn't help it. This mission was important. Not only because Naruto had things he needed to learn, but Kaoru couldn't imagine leaving Tazuna and Inari and the rest of Wave under Gatu's rule. But now, Kaoru's muscles were tense, and his eyes were flashing like lightning, focused entirely on Kakashi. "Kaoru-kun, we're not ready for this kind of mission," protested Sakura in a pleading voice. "We're not supposed to take B-ranked missions, we're only genin. We can keep going." Kaoru's anger faded into a soft frown and he glanced at Sakura curiously. Sakura was nervous, that was obvious from the way she rubbed her hands together in front of her chest. Kaoru's frown shifted from Sakura to Sasuke's stoic expression to Kakashi's apparent indifference. He remembered getting injured last time. That had been the argument used for going back to Konoha. The loser Naruto had needed medical attention, but they were all okay now. "Am I the only one who saw this time kick ass?" Kaoru demanded hotly. Naruto shot his hand up into the air eagerly with a large smile. Kaoru only saw the boy from the corner of his eye and his determination to make Kakashi see his point. "Okay, Sakura could work on her offense a bit," Kaoru admitted as he shrugged, not even pausing to acknowledge Naruto. Naruto put his hand down as quickly as he had raised it and Sakura's cheeks turned a pale shade of pink at Kaoru's observation. "Hey, Sakura-chan did good," protested Naruto loudly. She was protecting the old drunk. Kaoru shifted his attention from Kakashi to Naruto. The boy was frowning at his older cousin, not glaring but he was obviously displeased with Kaoru's choice of words. Kaoru flinched under the accusing gaze. He knew how important Sakura-chan was to Naruto, maybe even better than Naruto knew yet, but he also knew how much stronger Sakura would get. There was no reason for her not to start early. "Still, we don't know the whole situation," Kakashi mused into the silence that followed Naruto's proclamation. Kaoru frowned at Kakashi. Why was he hesitating? He didn't know anything about Zabuza yet, no one was injured, and his team had actually done a darn good job against their first enemies. Heck, he even had Kaoru along to make sure that Kaoru's eyes suddenly widened. That was why. Because he was with them. Kakashi didn't want to get too deep into a sticky situation with a ninja who might be a danger to Konoha as well as to his team directly. Kaoru gritted his teeth and turned to pick up his pack where he had dropped it to fight. To abandon one's duty is not courageous. Beneath the courageous, there is nothing. Keiru's gaze was one of pure determination when he looked back at the copy nin. Didn't Yondaime Hokage say that? Keiru watched Kakashi's eyes carefully. After all, his sensei had been the one who first quoted Yondaime's rhetoric to Keiru. But Kakashi retained his look of indifference, although it was hard to read a man who only let one lazy eye show. To Keiru's slight surprise, Naruto turned in step with Keiru and faced Kakashi, his glare matching his cousin's as he tried to stare his sensei into agreement. Kakashi simply let his gaze wander from his students to Tazuna and finally to Keiru. Then, he lifted his shoulders in an uncaring shrug. "All right," he acquiesced. "I guess we'll continue." Keiru gazed thoughtfully at Kakashi for a moment. He hadn't actually expected the Junin to cave so easily. He was going to have to be a lot more careful on this mission than he first anticipated. Then, Keiru felt the familiar prickle at the back of his neck that told him someone was watching him. He tensed for a brief moment before he noticed Naruto staring at him, beaming wide and proud. The older Uzumaki smiled suddenly and winked at Naruto. That decided, Kakashi seemed to get to business right away, with Keiru and Sasuke's help. After a small push from Keiru, Kakashi quickly tied both the unconscious ninja to a large tree by the side of the road and turned back to his client. "Tazuna-san," began the Junin in a strictly no-nonsense voice, "tell us exactly why these ninja are after you." The old drunk's mouth wavered a bit, but he seemed more sober now than Keiru had ever seen him before. "It's because of my bridge," answered the old man. "Wave isn't a very wealthy country. Most of the income we get comes from the shipping business. Building a bridge to the mainland of Hai no Kuni would make it possible for more people to trade goods and travel freely." Keiru remembered that bridge. It had still been standing last time he was in Konoha before everything burned. Had a good name, too. "But because I'm building the bridge, my life has been targeted by the owner of the shipping company." Tazuna lifted his eyes to the gray-haired man he was addressing. "You probably know his name, Gato." Keiru frowned. He remembered Gato, too. A part of him wanted to just break off from the mission and murder the guy in his sleep. But there were two things wrong with that idea. For one, he wasn't sure what the effort of killing Gato now would do to his seals or his ability to control them. For another, if he killed Gato, Naruto would never meet Zabuza and Haku, and he would never learn the price of being a ninja, of what his dream might cost him. "I've heard of him," Kakashi acknowledged. "He's one of the few wealthy people in the world." "Yes," Tazuna agreed nervously. "Most of his wealth has come from his shipping company. It's the only way to transport goods around the islands or to the mainland. He also works in smuggling items on the black market or bringing in illegal items." "So, you're his competition," ventured Sasuke. "He wants to stop you from building the bridge so that he can keep his monopoly." "Yeah." Tazuna nodded. Naruto huffed suddenly and shot a glare at Sasuke and his obvious show-off attitude. Keiru looked down at the boy, realizing that Naruto probably hadn't understood the implications of what Gato was doing or how he was hurting Wave Country. He'd have to fix that soon. Naruto always fought better when he was doing it for something worth fighting for. Rule number 1 had always been Haku's: people were at their strongest when protecting someone precious to them. "Well, what are we waiting for?" Naruto demanded as he started down the road again. "Idiot," scoffed Sasuke. Naruto bared his teeth at his largest, and basically only, rival. "He's got a point," Keiru noted calmly before the two boys started launching into insults. "If Gatu's rich, he'll be able to hire more skilled assassins than these two." He finished by nodding at the Kiri nin lashed to the tree. Keiru looked up to Kakashi, who hadn't moved throughout the explanation. "We should get to Wave as soon as possible," said Keiru. Kakashi simply nodded once in agreement. "Naruto and Sasuke will take point," he commanded, for once sounding like the superior officer that he was. "Keiru and Sakura will be in charge of protecting Tazuna, and I'll be Ted." Kakashi was putting himself in a position where he could keep an eye on his whole team, providing no one came up from behind them. But Keiru wasn't worried about any enemies other than Momochi Zabuza at the moment. Naruto walked forward determinedly with Sasuke trailing after him with a decidedly stoic expression on his face. Sakura's lips were pressed tightly together as she took one side of their client. Keiru hoped that he hadn't offended her with his comment on her fighting skills. His Sakura would have bashed his head in for even thinking such a thing, but this Sakura was far too timid to try it. Keiru shrugged on his pack and started walking on Tazuna's other side. He flexed his fingers in their gloves and looked down at his right hand suddenly. He had just realized that fighting the Demon Brothers had been the second fight since this whole mess started that he hadn't felt his seals hurt him even once. They were fine when he was sparring Naruto and Sasuke, and he hadn't felt any backlash during the brief bout on the road. He quelled the hope he felt rising from his lungs. It might not mean anything. He had been trying to be careful about his use of chakra, and the scrimmage against the Demon Brothers wasn't even that serious. Still, the fact that something could be different about his seals wasn't the kind of fact that could be ignored. Naruto craned his neck, trying to see his surroundings, but the mist that surrounded the boat the Genin team and Tazuna were scrunched into was too thick to see anything. "Naruto, settle down," Sakura snapped in a harsh whisper. "You're rocking the boat, idiot." Naruto's shoulders slumped heavily as he sank back into his seat. Sakura had somehow gotten a seat at the front of the boat with Sasuke while Naruto sat behind them with Kaoru. Tazuna and Kakashi were lined up behind them, and a thin man with a pointed bamboo hat stood in the back of the boat, pushing them forward with a long pole. Naruto folded his arms testily and glanced around at the people in the boat. At least that was more interesting than a bunch of water no one could see through. His gaze fell on his cousin, and he paused seriously. Kaoru was staring at his left arm, curling and uncurling his fingers in a fist like he was making sure they worked properly. "Hey, Kaoru-ni, you okay?" Naruto asked, keeping his voice low. If Kaoru's arms were bugging him, he didn't want anyone else to know about it. Not yet, anyway. He didn't want his teammates to think that his cousin was something to be feared. Kaoru's eyes lifted to look across to Naruto, and he smiled reassuringly. "Yeah." Kaoru shook his hand out and brought it to rest on his knee. "Don't worry, Gaki. I've got my stuff in my bag if something happens." Naruto worried his bottom lip in between his teeth as he frowned. If something happened, that wasn't really a good thought, considering that Kaoru had once said that his seals were what kept the demon in him from killing him. Naruto glanced at his teammates in the front of the boat. Sakura was too busy blushing at Sasuke to notice anything wrong with Kaoru. And Sasuke looked like he was trying really hard to ignore Sakura, so Kaoru's secret was safe for now. "Naruto," Kaoru called. Naruto's head snapped back to his cousin, his eyes wide to prove his determination to pay close attention when he saw the serious look in Kaoru's eyes. "Do you know why it's important to protect Tazuna from Gato?" queried the older boy. Naruto perked up with interest. This sounded like one of Kaoru-ni-san's tests to see how much Naruto knew. Well, he could pass this easy. "'Cause that's the mission," declared Naruto, a little louder now that they weren't discussing secret seals or demons. "And a Konoha ninja never abandons the mission." Yondaime was just about the coolest Hokage in the history of Konoha. Naruto had always thought that, ever since he had been old enough to hear the story of Yondaime's last stand against the Kyuubi no Kitsune. That respect and awe hadn't diminished when Naruto found out that the Kyuubi wasn't actually dead. In fact, it might have increased. Yondaime didn't just die in a mighty battle. He sacrificed himself in order to protect his village. That must be harder, Naruto thought. To know that the only way for someone else to live was for you to die. Besides, Naruto didn't really blame the man for picking him to be the container. He supposed that it had to be somebody, and Naruto was at least glad that no one else had to go through what he did in Konoha. So, upon learning that Yondaime Hokage, the coolest Hokage in Konoha history, had never abandoned his duty, Naruto wasn't about to abandon his. And it was his duty to get Tazuna home safely, despite stupid shipping guys trying to kill him. "Quiet, up there," snapped the man at the back of the boat. "You want someone to hear us?" Naruto flinched at the sharp reprimand as well as the glares that his teammates shot him. Sheesh, it wasn't like he was trying to get them all killed. "Good answer," Kaoru leaned over and muttered proudly at his cousin, "but there's more to it." Naruto's attention was once again on Kaoru, so curious that he didn't pay attention to Sasuke and Sakura listening in. "Gato controls all the transportation in Wave Country, so people have no choice but to go to him," began Kaoru. "That means that he can set the prices however high he wants. Like, he could charge someone twice as much as other people just because he doesn't like the guy." Naruto frowned. He knew what that felt like. When he had first gotten his apartment and started going to the academy, he went to the closest grocer for food. He watched an older lady in front of him pay for a loaf of bread, but when he stepped up to pay for his things, which mostly included instant ramen and all the makings for sandwiches, the guy behind the counter named a price that was at least 3 times as much as he had charged the old lady. It made more sense now that he knew why the guy had done that, but at the time he had been lucky enough to discover Ichiraku ramen. And since he smuggles stuff in, he controls the underground market, the redhead continued. People who sell stuff illegally, ninja for hire doing bad stuff. He gets rich, but he keeps everybody else poor. Naruto cocked his head and thought. So the guy was rich. Rich people were generally snobs in Naruto's experience, so the guy had 2 things against him already. He was a snob, and he was trying to kill Tazuna. People are scared of him, so they don't do anything to stop him or change their lives. Kaoru's gaze drifted to the bottom of the boat with his eyes half closed and thought. Leaders should never rule by fear. Makes people hate you. Naruto swallowed nervously. He wanted to be Hokage so that people would acknowledge him, so that people would see him and respect him. He still wanted to be Hokage. His role as the container for Kyuubi had only strengthened that goal. But the last thing he wanted was to accomplish his goal, to become the strongest ninja in Konoha, and to have everyone still hate him. That would be worse than never getting the hat at all. "You speak from experience, Kaoru-kun?" Kakashi asked from behind Naruto. Naruto twisted around to look at his smiling sensei. Kaoru just glanced over his shoulder calmly. "I've seen both extremes," he replied. "People will die for a leader they love and one they fear, just for different reasons. One out of loyalty and the other because there's no damn alternative. Kaoru hung his head again, staring at the wooden bottom of the boat. I've even seen a leader who loved the village so much that the leader was the one who died for it. Where was that? Asked Sakura curiously. Kaoru tilted his head up, looking surprised that the girl had actually spoken. He remained in that state for several moments, until Naruto was about to repeat the question. He wanted to know the answer, too, after all. Then, Kaoru's gaze turned blank as he replied. Konoha. Sakura frowned at him curiously while Naruto hung his head and prayed no one was looking at H fabric of his jacket over his stomach. Yondaime. We're getting close, the boatman announced into the mist. We should be able to see the bridge soon. Naruto shook off thoughts of sacrifices and demon foxes and glanced up, staring through the mist. After a few moments, the heavy air parted slowly to reveal a towering support leading up to a giant structure. Naruto gaped silently, remembering the need to be quiet. The thing was huge. They could probably fit the whole academy on the bridge and still have room to walk around either side. Beside Naruto, Kaoru craned his neck up as he stared and let out a low, impressed whistle. Nice bridge, old man, he commented softly. A puzzled frown suddenly crossed his face as he continued to stare at the bridge. How many people you got working on it? About 50, replied Tazuna. It's almost half the village. Why? Just wondering, Kaoru responded and dropped the subject. The boatman commented that they were going to take a route with lots of vegetation or something. Naruto didn't catch the whole plan, but he began to understand when they sailed silently through a wide tunnel. It was like a secret passage to the other side. When they broke out into sunlight again, the mist was gone and the water in front of them was dotted with short, fat trees that grew right out of the water. Wow, breathed Naruto. He smiled, fascinated by something so different than anything he had seen in Konoha. Kaoru-ni-san was right. Scenery was cool. Kaoru once again walked beside Tazuna as the team started down the road for Tazuna's house on the outskirts of the village. They had disembarked in general silence, except for Tazuna's admonition to get him home to his daughter and grandson safely. Even Naruto was strangely serious about the mission. Part of Kaoru was worried that he might have made too great an impression on the boy, but he ignored that part in favor of keeping all his senses trained to pick up any sign of a certain eyebrow-less nuke nin from Kirikuger. That was the greater danger just now. You seem tense, Kaoru-kun, called Kakashi from the rear of the party. Kaoru glanced over his shoulder to see Kakashi's smiling face. He was starting to get an idea of how Kakashi's enemies felt when they faced the copy nin. That single crinkled eye that hid a smile when there was really no cause to smile was kind of unsettling. Understatement of the year, Kakashi-sensei, Kaoru muttered back. He rolled his shoulders back and stuck his hands in his pockets out of habit. I guess I'm just nervous about what happens next. What does happen next? Was the obvious follow-up question, so Kaoru had at least anticipated it. That's the problem. One side of his mouth lifted into a knowing smirk. I don't know yet. He sighed and paused long enough so that he was walking in step with Kakashi, leaving Tazuna's protection up to Sakura. Someone stronger than those two back there will probably take their place. Kaoru jerked his head backwards to indicate the road where they had left the demon brothers. So, a chunin at least, maybe a junin. What rank did you say you held in Whirlpool? Kakashi interrupted suddenly. Kaoru looked up to meet Kakashi's eye. It was a valid question, and probably meant either to confirm Kaoru's story or to trap him in his own lie. I've only ever been a genin, answered Kaoru seriously and without hesitation. Same as your students, Kakashi. There were certain benefits to hiding the truth within a lie. It made explanations a little more complicated, but at least Kaoru didn't feel so guilty. Kakashi's sudden glance to the woods surrounding the road disrupted Kaoru's thoughts and put him on guard instead. Kakashi had always been better than him at sensing chakra. Someone was close by. There, Naruto shouted abruptly from his place at point, flinging a kunai into the underbrush in front of him. As soon as a loud thunk signaled the kunai connecting to its target, Naruto rushed forward eagerly to see what he had caught. Sasuke followed the blonde a few steps behind while Sakura withdrew a kunai and stood in a defensive position in front of Tazuna. Kaoru nodded in approval. Sakura hadn't even chewed Naruto out for his sudden shout. The kids were taking this very seriously now. However, the mood vanished when Naruto pulled a tearfully scared and shaking white rabbit out of the bushes. Oh, just a bunny, the genin noted in wonder. Naruto no baka. Sakura stomped the ground furiously. Don't scare me like that. Look what you did to the poor thing. Sasuke smirked as Naruto tried to comfort the rabbit, which by this time seemed to want nothing more than to be out of the arms that were currently trying to smother it with reassuring love. But Kaoru just frowned as the ambient noises of Team 7 faded. There was something wrong with that rabbit. He couldn't remember what, but there was something wrong. Naruto, forget the bunny, Kaoru snapped as soon as he realized what was off. Huh? Naruto just frowned, his arms slacking almost in reflex. Why? It's white. Kaoru stepped forward just far enough to stand beside Tazuna, to match the snow. What snow? demanded Naruto. Kaoru just gave the boy a, no kidding, look. It's a decoy, Sasuke finally realized. Kaoru noticed the whoosh of the blade almost the same time as Kakashi did, but the Junin was faster in his warning. Down, Kakashi commanded. Kaoru grabbed the back of Tazuna's shirt and yanked the bridge builder to the ground as he used the other hand to shove Sakura out of the way. Naruto dropped the traumatized rabbit and fell on his stomach with his hands covering his head in an instinctively protective position. Sasuke leapt backwards and used his hands to drop into a low crouch. Kaoru felt the air above his head part with the force of the Zanbato, but he kept his eyes open. The sound of a blade sinking deep into wood signaled the end of the attack, and Kaoru stood up warily. So, it seems the old man brought some protection with him. The man standing on the giant cleaver, using the blade stuck horizontally in the tree as a platform, looked slapped together at best. Bandages wrapped around his nose and mouth, and his forehead was noticeably bare except for a crooked hide high on his hairline with a deep, straight scratch through the symbol for Kirikuger. He had no shirt, just a couple leather straps that looked like they were holding up his high pants, and a pair of arm guards that reached above his elbows. Kaoru saw Naruto and Sasuke scramble to their feet and stare at their new opponent, one in hesitation and the other suspiciously guarded. Now on his feet, Kaoru placed himself between the nuke nin and Tazuna as the old man held Sakura up. Copy nin Kakashi, Momochi Zabuza acknowledged the masked Konoha ninja making his way to the front of the party. Sorry, but the old man is mine. Chapter 10. Kaoru stared at Zabuza, struck by the strange thought that the nuke nin had looked much taller in his memories. Then again, the genin had also been about 6 inches shorter at the time. You four protect Tazuna, Kakashi ordered with none of his usual, hip, attitude. This guy is above any of you. His orders issued, Kakashi lifted his left hand, wrapped his fingers around his hide, and shoved it up to his forehead in one swift motion. Kaoru didn't even glance at his sensei to see what he already knew was under Kakashi's headband. So, you grace me with the Sharingan. Zabuza showed no surprise, only confidence. Not that it'll do you much good. Sharingan? Naruto piped up. From the corner of his eye, Kaoru saw the shorter blonde turn to his teammate, confused. Hey, isn't that your blood eye thing, Sasuke Teme? He demanded. Sasuke flinched at the question. It was subtle, but Kaoru caught the movement. He wasn't sure what was going through the Uchiha's head, then again, he never was. But he knew that any questions that either boy had would have to wait. Naruto, Kaoru called in a steady voice, never taking his eyes from Zabuza. Focus on the guy with the giant sword, please. Naruto snapped to attention at Kaoru's voice, facing Zabuza once again, and Sasuke dismissed any hesitation in favor of scowling at the man who had interrupted their mission. Zabuza just chuckled lightly and brought one hand in front of his bandaged chin. Kirigakure no jutsu. The fact that Kaoru was expecting the sudden mist that descended onto the road didn't quite prepare him for the sudden chill, a direct result of the strong sake that came with it. Heart, head, liver, kidneys. Kaoru edged closer to Tazuna as Zabuza's voice emerged from the mist, listing off all the targets on the human body that promised an instant kill. Something that every assassin worth his salt would know, not to mention most chunin or higher. The problem was that his team wasn't chunin yet. 8 points, echoed the voice of the nuke nin. Which should I hit first? A shaking hand caught Kaoru's attention, and his eyes widened when he saw a kunai turn towards its owner almost involuntarily. He laid his right hand on the boy's shoulder before the killing intent could drive him completely out of his mind. Sasuke, he called. In shock, either from the touch or the sound of his own name, Sasuke looked at Kaoru with his dark eyes wide in near panic. Kaoru kept calm. It was easier for him. He had dealt with much more dangerous opponents than the Demon of the Mist, and looked directly into Sasuke's eyes like he hadn't been able to for years. It's all right, he reassured the genin with nothing but confidence. Me and Kakashi'll never let you guys die, I promise. You won't be able to keep that promise. Zabuza was suddenly right in front of Sasuke with his arms cocked back and his sword prepped for a swing. If his stroke followed through with his aim, Zabuza would take off Sasuke's head with one quick motion. Kaoru tightened his grip on Sasuke's shoulder and twisted his body while pulling Sasuke towards him, drawing a kunai with his left hand. With his back facing Zabuza and his body between the missing nin and his teammate, Kaoru raised his short blade just in time to stop the giant blade mid-swing. Kaoru felt the reverberation of metal striking metal travel from his fingertips to his shoulder and turned his head sideways to glare at the man behind him. I never go back on my word, he spat out firmly. It was one thing that he refused to change about himself. All the lines that Kaoru refused to cross were mostly the ones he had drawn for himself. Before either Kaoru or Zabuza moved out of their stalemate, Kakashi intervened by wrapping one arm around the enemy's neck and holding a kunai to Zabuza's throat, the weapon resting gently on the jugular. Kaoru watched Kakashi slide his blade swiftly across Zabuza's throat, only to have the man's body shift into a column of water that held its form briefly then crashed to the ground. Mizu Bunshin, Sasuke identified, apparently out of his slump. Of course it was a water clone. There was no way Zabuza was going to make things that easy for them. Kakashi turned around quickly and scanned the area for the real body while Karu shifted his kunai to his right hand and stepped up to stand beside his sensei. The only acknowledgement he got was a glance from Kakashi's Sharingan. "Don't push it, Karu." The lack of any honorific from Kakashi worried Karu more than he thought it would. This guy is a missing nin from Mist. Demon Momochi Zabuza. Demon, Sakura repeated worriedly. Karu glanced over his shoulder at his team. Sakura had once again taken her wary position in front of Tazuna, with Naruto and Sasuke on either flank. Both Naruto and Sasuke had weapons in hand and were scanning their surroundings desperately. Sakura still looked a little shaky, but she stood firm. "So, it seems you've heard the story." Zabuza's voice caught the attention of the Konoha nin once again. But this time, it only originated from a singular place. Karu looked up. Straight in front of the ill-prepared party, the mist was slowly parting to reveal Zabuza standing on the shores of what looked like a lake. Zabuza didn't seem in a hurry to start anything, which meant Kakashi was free to continue with his explanation. "Kiri goes through a different graduation technique than Konoha," began the Junin. "In order to become ninja, the students must pass a test. A fight to the death." Karu wasn't really surprised that Zabuza looked like he was actually enjoying the retelling of the story. He knew the value of scaring your opponents shitless before the battle even began. Fortunately, Zabuza didn't know that the story of his nickname was old news to Karu. One year there was a child who killed over 100 students. Those who would have been his comrades. Kakashi retained his ready position in front of his students, but he didn't command Karu to get back. At least, he hadn't yet. It was a massacre. He earned the nickname Devil Zabuza. "I've seen a demon before," Karu commented as he glared at Zabuza. "That is just a man." A man he had previously seen shed tears over someone that he claimed was just a tool. It was another one of the rules. Shinobi always started out as human, and even those farthest removed from that state could occasionally be reminded of who they had once been. Karu brought his hands together and summoned a clone without even naming his best kick-ass technique. The two redheads both shifted into a fighting stance and prepared to charge when a gloved hand suddenly appeared in front of Karu's face. "Don't," Kakashi commanded coldly. The original Karu stared at the Junin while his clone kept an eye, or two, on Zabuza. "You know I can fight, Kakashi," Karu accused the Junin softly. "Let me help." Kakashi continued to watch Zabuza as Karu kept his eyes on Kakashi. Zabuza, for his part, seemed perfectly content to watch the unfolding drama before him. The thought that Zabuza was getting some entertainment out of all this flitted across Karu's mind as many of his thoughts did before he found something better, or more important, to concentrate on. And right now, he could think of one last argument in his repertoire. "I know you don't trust me to protect Konoha," Karu admitted. "At least trust me to protect my family." Kakashi knew the importance of precious people, having already lost his once. If Karu could convince him that the redhead lived for his precious people, even if Kakashi believed that Naruto was the only one Karu cared about, it would be better than having Kakashi believe that Karu was nothing more than a spy out for the power a jinchuriki would provide. "Don't get caught by his sword," Kakashi suddenly ordered, and Karu knew that he had been acknowledged. "Just keep that eye of yours open, Kakashi-sensei." He couldn't stop the cheeky grin that formed on his face, a remnant of a confident Naruto who fought alongside his sensei against an horrified by their black and red cloaks. Kakashi and Karu, together with Karu's clone, charged at Zabuza. Knowing that Kakashi needed to see Zabuza's actions if he was to copy them, Karu sent his clone onto the lake and around Zabuza's back. As long as he could keep his chakra usage down to his clones and leave the real fighting up to Kakashi, everything should be good. He might even get a chance to prove himself to Kakashi, who might then pass his pure intentions on to Sandaime. If Karu wasn't so focused on the fight, he might have actually busted out into a wide grin. Unworried, Zabuza turned to Karu's clone first and lifted one hand to his covered mouth. Sweden. Mizoram Paw. The ensuing wave that emerged from the region of Zabuza's mouth hit Karu's clone square in the chest and dispelled it before Zabuza turned back to Kakashi and Karu. He used his momentum to swing his sword at Karu's head. Karu ducked under the blade and let Kakashi block it with a kunai. The three ninja traded blows for a while, but Karu knew that the water was Zabuza's territory. They needed something to push the battle in their favor. And since Zabuza was sticking to his giant sword, Kakashi couldn't copy any of his jutsu. Karu's good feelings were slowly disappearing. He jumped away from the nuke nin in the hopes of bribing him with an open opportunity to smack the redhead with a technique that Kakashi would see. Instead, Zabuza froze and fell straight down into the lake, as if he had just released his hold on the surface of the water. Karu turned sharp eyes to Kakashi, who looked just as puzzled as Karu felt. Winking his right eye closed, Kakashi used his Sharingan to glance around the lake while Karu just observed. His eyes went immediately to the genin on the shore. Sakura and Sasuke stood in front of Tazuna while Naruto still had his kunai out and looked ready to intervene in the battle if he thought he was needed. Kaoru really hoped that Naruto wouldn't be needed. It was mostly dumb luck that his team had gotten through the wave mission the first time around. A combination of Zabuza underestimating the genin of Konoha and Haku's reluctance to kill anyone who had a precious person like he did. Kaoru didn't want to press his luck too hard. Suddenly, Zabuza seemed to rise out of the lake behind Kakashi. Even as Kaoru opened his mouth to warn Kakashi, Zabuza swung his zanbato faster than any human should have been able to wield a sword of that size. Kakashi turned suddenly, but the blade caught his right side and knocked him 15 yards further from shore. He landed with a large splash that signaled Kakashi hadn't had enough stamina or agility after that hit to catch himself. "Bastard," Kaoru growled. Zabuza didn't respond, he just melted back into the water. Kaoru resigned himself to scanning the lake again for any sign of his enemy, all while keeping an eye out for Kakashi. He still didn't know how hard his sensei had been hit. Kaoru's eyes widened at the sight of Kakashi slowly pulling himself onto the surface of the lake as if he was climbing out of a crevasse. Even if Kaoru hadn't remembered what he knew was going to happen next, he remembered enough of Kiri's jutsu to recognize the danger. "Kakashi!" Kaoru shot forward toward the man. "Get out of the water." Bringing his hands together once again, Kaoru created 2 more clones easily. One of the red-headed figures shot forward with an extra speed born of focusing more chakra than was healthy to the soles of his feet. He grabbed Kakashi by the green vest on his sensei's body just as Zabuza rose out of the water beside them both. Kaoru rolled onto his back on the surface of the water, vaulting Kakashi over his head and using his feet to fling the Junin out of the way. Kakashi landed in the arms of the Kaoru nearest to the shore, hitting the clone with enough force to dispel it. The clone turned into a cloud of smoke, having fulfilled its purpose of slowing Kakashi's flight enough for the man to land on the ground without too much bruising. The Kaoru left over watched the redhead on his back get to his knees on the surface of the lake as a sheet of water rose from the lake and encompassed him, coming to a point at Zabuza's outstretched right hand. I suppose you're my conciliatory prize," muttered Zabuza to the genin in his Suiru no Jutsu. For an answer, Kaoru allowed himself a freedom that he hadn't in years. He stuck out his tongue childishly at his enemy and disappeared with a slight poof. Kaoru, still standing on the water halfway between Zabuza and the wounded Kakashi, planted his hands on his hips and smiled triumphantly at the nuke nin. Cage Bunshin was the best technique ever. "Not good enough." Zabuza's voice suddenly came from behind Kaoru. "Of course, clones could only get you so far, especially if your opponent could use them just as well." Kaoru only watched Zabuza and his water prison long enough to see the body on the water start to melt back into liquid. He spun around just in time to be faced with another sheet of water, this time utterly trapped. And Zabuza knew it. "It's no use," commented Zabuza as Kaoru glared at the wall of water. "You can't break through my water prison." Kaoru breathed deeply and forced his eyes to focus beyond the water to his team still on the shore. Sasuke and Naruto were kneeling on either side of their bleeding sensei while Sakura hung back with one arm held out in an attempt either to shield Tazuna or to stop him from going anywhere. Kakashi seemed on the brink of consciousness, just awake enough to hold one hand to the gash in his side to slow the bleeding. "Sakura," Kaoru called firmly, "there's a medkit in my pack. Get Kakashi and stop the bleeding." He knew Sakura wasn't the same as she had been, or would be. A competent med nin who refused to take crap from any wounded teammate. But Kaoru truly believed that Sakura had been that way all along. Tsunade had just brought that side out of her. Or it could have been the betrayal of Sasuke for power. Either way, his command was awkwardly being followed as Sakura, with Sasuke's help, half-tugged and half-dragged Kakashi's body back to where Tazuna waited. Naruto had rushed to the side and was returning with his cousin's canvas pack, rummaging through it as he approached the party. "Your struggling is pointless," Zabuza declared, holding one hand in front of his chin. Another Mizu Bunshin slowly rose from the lake, its eyes intent on the struggling party. "Naruto, Sasuke," Kaoru's warning was almost unnecessary. Naruto had already dropped the small box filled with rolls of bandages, gauze pads, and antibiotics next to Sakura and was facing the clone. Sasuke had stepped in front of where Kakashi was trying valiantly to sit up straight and Sakura was trying valiantly to keep him down while she worked. Kaoru saw both boys glance from the clone to Zabuza's true body, catching Kaoru's eye in the process. "Don't worry, guys." He gave his teammates a confident smirk, "I'll be out of here in a minute." "Has anyone ever told you that you talk too much, brat?" Zabuza demanded of his prisoner. He sounded like he was debating between being annoyed or amused. Kaoru tended to have that effect on people. Kaoru shifted his gaze up to Zabuza, his smirk drooping into a knowing smile. "Yeah," he replied, "but they're all dead." That wasn't really true. Most of the people who complained about Kaoru's love of noise because it was better than silence simply didn't exist yet. At least not in the way that Kaoru had last seen them. But it was about time that Kaoru did some intimidating of his own. Besides, he had been in Kisami's Suiru no Jutsu enough times to know how to bust out. He just prayed that his seals would continue to cooperate. It wasn't the demon's chakra he wanted. Sakura silently commanded her hands to stop trembling as she pressed another thick sheet of medical gauze into Kakashi's side. Half of her brain was remembering the few lectures and demonstrations they had gone through on first aid in the academy, while the other half was trying to pay attention. Naruto and Sasuke in between her and Zabuza's Mizu Bunshin. Kakashi-sensei breathing heavily as she leaned on his wound, and Tazuna hovering over her, smelling like seawater and sake. It was wreaking hell on her concentration. Fortunately, Kakashi seemed to know what she was doing and leaned forward enough so that Sakura could wrap the largest roll of bandages around his torso. He was obviously sweating, but he remained still. "Hey, is he gonna be alright?" Tazuna demanded in a rough voice. Sakura didn't even stop working as she shot a glare at their client. Look at the babies, pretending to be ninja. Distracted enough to forget about Tazuna's alcohol breath, Sakura stared at her teammates worriedly. Naruto and Sasuke were side by side, unmoving in front of Zabuza's clone, which looked murderously amused at the moment. Part of Sakura wanted nothing more than to run the opposite direction, maybe all the way back to Konoha. But her teammates were still fighting. Kaoru was still trapped on the lake, and Kakashi was still under her care. "Hey, Sasuke." Naruto's voice was surprisingly serious in a way Sakura had never heard from him, not even when he had been trying to convince his team that his cousin was actually a cool guy. "Listen for a sec. You got a plan?" Sasuke demanded in the same tone. Even with his back turned to Sakura, she could hear the smirk crawl into his voice. "Fine, Dobi." Sakura turned her eyes back to her work and kept wrapping her sensei's abdomen in the bandages she had borrowed from Keiru's pack. She was only half aware of Naruto making 5 clones and charging at Zabuza's clone while he himself stayed back. Meanwhile, Sasuke dashed to the right, his hand extended to catch the Fuma shuriken that Naruto had thrown to him. The Mizu Bunshin easily dispatched Naruto's clones and cleared the smoke away from in front of him, only to see a windmill shuriken flying directly to his face. "You're far too obvious," the clone sneered as he caught the large blade in one hand. Then, Sakura saw his eyes widen when he realized that there was more than one weapon aimed at him. Instead of dodging the shadow shuriken, however, the Mizu Bunshin reached out his left hand and caught the second blade. Sakura bit her lip worriedly as she once again considered the possibility of running away. Zabuza already had Keiru trapped. Kakashi was only just sitting up crookedly. And Naruto's big plan had just provided their enemy with 2 perfectly good weapons. Suddenly, the 4-bladed weapon in the clone's left hand became enveloped in a cloud of smoke. Sakura's eyes lifted in a surprise that gave her a slight bit of hope, only for it to fail when she saw a grinning Naruto surface out of the haze. "Surprise!" called the blonde an instant before he drove a simple kunai into the arm that held him. Zabuza's face barely had the time to register his surprise before he melted back into the water. His support gone, Naruto fell into the lake as the orange-clad body still on the shore with Sasuke disappeared. Sakura tied off the bandages on Kakashi's stomach and turned back towards the half-awake man. "Kakashi-sensei," she called tentatively. Kakashi laid one hand onto Sakura's shoulder to brace himself and slowly stood. Sakura nearly buckled under his weight, but she locked her knees and remained still as her sensei stood. "Thank you, Sakura," murmured the Junin. Sasuke turned around at the sound of his sensei's voice, and Naruto clambered out of the lake, shaking the water out of his hair as he went. "Naruto, Sasuke," Kakashi called to his students, "good teamwork." Sasuke sighed and set his shoulders a bit higher in a way that suggested he was pleased with the comment, even if his face didn't show it. "What about Keiru ni-san?" demanded a soaked Naruto. "He's still trapped." "Case Ken." The 4 shinobi on the shore all turned their eyes to the lake when they heard the shout. Keiru was holding his hand extended in front of him, and a thin blade, colored faintly blue, stretched from his fingers to where he was pointing at Zabuza's side. Sakura watched closely as Zabuza jumped backwards and slipped his hand from the globe of water he was holding together. Zabuza's left hand curled around his stomach to his side and came away bloody. The water prison around Keiru slowly dissolved as the redhead stood, the blue light still radiating from his right hand. "Told Yaoi get out, Gaki," Keiru called to Naruto as he held up his right hand. "Was that chakra?" Sakura had read somewhere that you could give chakra a shape, but no book or scroll at the academy had described how to do it. But it looked like Keiru had simply taken his chakra and shaped it into a blade that was sharp enough to cut through the water prison and injure Zabuza. "Keiru ni," Naruto's shout was one of anxiety rather than relief, and it took Sakura a moment to see why. Then she saw Zabuza charging for Keiru's back and tensed as if she were the one expecting a blow. Keiru spun around and blocked Zabuza's raised sword with his blade of chakra. But Keiru suddenly faltered, stumbling on one leg as his left foot suddenly dipped below the surface of the water. Zabuza pressed his advantage and slammed his foot into Keiru's stomach. Keiru shot back towards the shore again and skidded to a halt near Naruto's feet. "Ni-san," Naruto called urgently as he hovered over the redhead. The stomach, muttered Keiru with his eyes closed tightly. Why is it always the stomach? Keiru jerked up to a sitting position with one hand behind him to support his weight while the other clutched at his stomach through his dark shirt. Stay with the client, Keiru, ordered Kakashi suddenly. I'm going to finish this. Kakashi suddenly disappeared from Sakura's side and reappeared on the surface of the lake, facing Zabuza. Sakura saw Zabuza transfer his sword to his back, leaving his hands free for the next round of fighting. Trusting her sensei to take care of the nuke nin, Sakura scooped up the medkit lying on the ground and hurried toward where Keiru sat. I'm fine, Gaki, Keiru was reassuring Naruto as Sakura came closer. Are you sure? It was Sasuke who posed the question, even though Naruto looked just as dubious. Gimme a second. Keiru frowned at the ground, not meeting his teammate's eyes. He pried his hand from his stomach and studied it curiously, curling it into a fist carefully, then releasing his grip just as slowly. They're working, he announced with a slight groan. Hurts like crazy, so they must be working. What's working? Inquired Sakura. A loud shout from the lake distracted her. Sakura shifted her gaze back to the battle just in time to see twin dragons of water rise from the lake, one behind each of the combatants, and crash into each other. Kakashi's got his Sharingan working finally, commented Keiru as he shifted to his knees with Naruto's arm wrapped around his neck. What is it? Naruto frowned at the battle. The Sharingan is a trait of Uchiha. Sasuke answered coldly. It can see any method of taijutsu, ninjutsu, and genjutsu and copy it. So, whatever Zabuza can do, Kakashi-sensei can do, translated Naruto. Yeah, he's had that eye since the last shinobi war, ground out Keiru. It's why he's famous. Copy nin Kakashi. Zabuza's body flying into a tree beside the road interrupted the sudden conversation as Kakashi landed more gracefully between the nuke nin and the team of genin. Sakura saw a dark splotch on Kakashi's new bandages and worried that her work hadn't been good enough. Keiru grunted as he stood up and faced Zabuza with Naruto and Sasuke. Your foresight is getting annoying, Hitaki, Zabuza growled in a darker tone than the amused sound that Sakura had heard from him before. The missing nin straightened slowly and pushed himself off the tree. You want to hear a prediction, Zabuza? Kakashi ignored Zabuza's irritation and just looked at him with a blood-red eye with 3 small dots spinning around his pupil. You're going to die. No sooner had the words left Kakashi's mouth than Zabuza drew eyes wide and unfocused. Sakura froze and watched wide-eyed as Zabuza slumped to the ground with at least 4 round needles embedded into his neck. You were right, a light voice came from above Zabuza's suddenly still body. He died. Sakura looked up with the others to see a figure crouching on a branch in the tree that Zabuza had hit. The newcomer to the battle wore a white mask with a curved, red line cutting across the mask horizontally where the mouth should have been. The eye holes were cut like slits and gave the mask the general impression of a smiling spirit. It was a bit unnerving. Hey, who's that? Naruto demanded, jabbing his finger rudely at the masked figure. Keiru suddenly let out a rasping cough and hunched over his stomach again. Keiru ni? Naruto called worriedly. Calm down. Keiru just laid one hand on Naruto's shoulder and straightened enough to look past Kakashi's back to Zabuza's prone body and the masked figure in the tree. He's a hunter nin. They're like anbu, but their only job is to hunt down and kill missing nin like Zabuza. Indeed, the now identified hunter nin agreed. Kirigakure has been after Momochi Zabuza for some time now. Now that the hunter nin was on the ground, Sakura could see the 4 small lines in the forehead of his mask, the symbol of the village hidden in mist. The ninja also looked like he was even shorter than Keiru. The hunter nin wrapped one arm around Zabuza's body and lifted it easily. And now, if you will excuse me. The masked boy held 2 fingers in front of his mask where his mouth probably was hidden and disappeared suddenly. The silence that followed only lasted for about 5 seconds. That guy was like our age, protested Naruto loudly. How can he be as strong as Anbu? It happens sometimes. Kakashi sounded extremely tired. Sakura sighed and started to think that maybe they would be all right now. Zabuza was apparently dead, and everyone was still standing, still breathing. All right, Tazuna suddenly found his voice again. I'm glad I got you guys to protect me. Yeah, muttered Keiru in a low voice, we're a shitload of scary. Sakura turned to frown at Keiru, partly for his language and partly because she really didn't want to fight with their client anymore. But then, Kakashi fell face down onto the hard-packed earth of the road. Kakashi-sensei. Sakura cried desperately. Keiru started forward only to stumble on his first step. He caught himself by slapping his right hand onto his knee and supporting himself heavily. Keiru ni-san, I'm okay. Keiru interrupted Naruto's concern suddenly and continued plodding toward the unconscious man. Keiru knelt beside Kakashi and flipped the junin over to his back. Sakura watched Keiru pass a hand over her first aid work on Kakashi's side before Keiru tugged Kakashi's headband back over his right eye so that it sat crookedly on his head as it always did. He's just passed out, announced Keiru after a beat. He looked up to Tazuna. How far to your house, old man? It's just on the other side of the village. Tazuna gestured weakly down the road. Is he gonna buy okay? I can't do a lot for him, Kaoru answered. But he'll be better off in a bed than on the road. Kaoru grabbed one of Kakashi's arms and lifted it over his shoulder before his knee hit the ground hard again. I can do it, Kaoru ni, Naruto declared. Sakura was impressed. Instead of bragging like Naruto usually did, the shorter boy was simply offering to help out his cousin. She pressed her lips together and watched Naruto make 4 shadow clones. 2 clones took Kakashi's arms and shifted the Junin's weight to their backs while the other 2 held up Kakashi's legs so that they didn't drag behind him. Maybe Kaoru's presence had made Naruto a little more mature. Just a little. Sakura stepped up as Naruto's clones turned away and started down the road, following Tazuna. Do you need any first aid, Kaoru-kun? She asked softly, but the redhead just shook his head. It's mostly chakra exhaustion, he replied, getting slowly to his feet. Sakura wrapped one arm around his waist to support him as she had for Kakashi before her conscience, which had a tendency to be rather crude and loud, could insinuate anything. Kaoru smiled at her and patted her shoulder. Sakura took it as her signal to let go, biting her lip nervously as she watched Kaoru to make sure he could stand properly. Kaoru scanned the area once, maybe to make sure there was about to jump out at them. Sakura squished the thought down before she jinxed herself. That would be just their luck, with the way this mission was going. Instead, Kaoru let his gaze stop at the dark-haired boy still standing just off the road by the lake. Come on, Sasuke. Kaoru gestured with a jerk of his head. Sakura followed his gaze and smiled encouragingly at Sasuke. The boy just shoved his hands into his pockets and followed Kaoru's slow steps after Tazuna and Naruto. Kakashi woke to the strange sight of a wooden slatted ceiling. He was vaguely aware of his position lying down on a thin mat and covered by a blanket, as if someone had tucked him in. His Sharingan was also covered, and he knew he hadn't had the strength to pull down his high 8 after his fight. Well, at least his students hadn't left him on the side of the road. You're awake, a voice noted from beside him. Kakashi craned his neck, his perception back down to one eye, and took in the small room that housed his bed. Uzumaki Kaoru sat on the floor beside Kakashi's bedroll with his forearms resting on his knees. He looked slightly more relaxed than usual in his regular uniform of a long-sleeved dark shirt and his regular black pants, but his weapons holster was noticeably missing from his right thigh. Where are we? Demanded Kakashi, slightly surprised that he still had the strength to talk. He already knew that he was suffering from chakra exhaustion and wouldn't be moving for a while. He had used his Sharingan too much in that last battle. Plus, Zabuza's sword had caught him in the side, and while Sakura had bandaged the wound as well as she could, he knew it wasn't enough to hold for long. Tazuna's house, Kaoru answered. You passed out after the battle. I think it was the blood loss plus chakra exhaustion. I sewed up your wound. Sorry, but I don't know any ijutsu. Kakashi wondered briefly how Kaoru had made the diagnosis if he didn't know medical jutsu, but then again the gaping wound in his side wasn't that hard to spot. The effort of holding his head up was making Kakashi's head pound with every beat of his heart, and he laid his head back down on the bed while keeping an eye on Kaoru. Tazuna's daughter and grandson live here, too, continued the redhead. Naruto's patrolling the perimeter with his shadow clones, and Sakura and Sasuke went to the bridge with Tazuna to do a preliminary scout. The bridge is wide and open, easy to see an attack coming and defend. Kakashi blinked once instead of letting his surprise show on his mostly hidden face. Thorough report, was his only remark, but it was an honest one. In one breath, Kaoru had given him the location of his team, the progress of the mission, and the layout of the terrain with all the professionalism of a soldier reporting to his commander. Then, there had been the way Kaoru fell into a leadership role so easily in the fight against Zabuza. Even while in that water prison, he was barking orders to his team, making sure everyone knew what part to play. Are you sure you were a genin? Kakashi asked nonchalantly. For a response, Kaoru simply lifted one shoulder in a shrug. Only time I took the Chunin exams, I failed, he explained. Never got the chance to take them again. Too busy trying not to die. Kakashi suddenly remembered Kaoru explaining his strengths to his team. The teenager had said that everyone was fighting, which supposedly explained how he learned taijutsu. It could be, if Whirlpool had been fighting a strong enemy, that Kaoru was forced into a position of more responsibility than genin regularly took on. NTAL note to research how the village had been destroyed once he got back to Konoha, if they all lived that long. Suddenly, a short boy in an orange jumpsuit charged into the room, scanning the area once before breaking out into a panting smile. Kakashi-sensei, you're awake. A gleeful smile accompanied Naruto's statement. Kakashi winced under his mask. The boy was almost too free with his emotions, according to Kakashi. He reminded him too much of. What's up, Gaki? Kaoru's short question broke into Kakashi's train of thought. Oh, Tsunami has dinner ready, replied Naruto, turning towards his brother figure. You want us to keep patrolling? No, Kaoru answered. We'll be right there. Naruto nodded eagerly, then turned to leave the room as quickly as he had entered. Suddenly, Kaoru called him back with a brief, "Hey. You don't have to tell Naruto everything I say." Kaoru shook his head at the orange-clad boy. Naruto frowned while Kakashi wondered why Kaoru referred to Naruto in the third person. "Just dispel," Kaoru instructed with a wave of his hand. "We can do that, Naruto." "No, Naruto's clone," asked with a puzzled frown. "Let go of the jutsu, and you'll disappear." The blond boy frowned, then put his hands together and stared at them questioningly. Then he squeezed his eyes shut as if preparing himself for a blow. Pop! Instead of dispelling with a soft puff of smoke, the body gave a barely visible shudder and returned to stillness. One blue eye opened hesitantly and a pair of hands patted down his body to check that he was still there. "I guess we'll work on that," sighed Kaoru. He lifted one hand to wave the clone out of the room. "Tell Tsunami-san we're coming." Kakashi watched Naruto's famously orange jacket disappear out the door as Kaoru remained sitting. The teenager, Kakashi realized, was trying to teach Naruto the finer points of Kage Bunshin. That still didn't explain how Kaoru knew the body had been a clone, or why he was determined to teach Naruto in the first place. Luckily, Kakashi's face had changed from curiosity once again to indifference by the time Kaoru turned to him. "Can you walk?" the oldest genin demanded, "or do you want your meal here?" "You seem very concerned with helping my team stay alive, Kaoru-kun," Kakashi remarked instead of answering. If not for the lightly joking tone Kakashi always managed to convey, the sentence would have sounded more like an accusation. Kaoru seemed to read underneath the underneath, regardless. "I had a team once, too, Kakashi-sensei." The teenager kept his eyes hooded and on the floor in front of him. "I want this one to stay alive." Kaoru braced his hands on his thighs and gritted his teeth together as he stood. It seemed he hadn't escaped injury in his battle with Zabuza, either. "How did you know Naruto was a clone?" Kakashi inquired. He was in no shape for an interrogation, but curiosity remained persistent. "He said, us," answered the genin. "Not me, I'll bring you up some food, Kakashi-sensei." The last sentence was shouted over Kaoru's shoulder as he exited the room, leaving Kakashi staring at the ceiling once again. The Junin knew that Kaoru had become attached to Naruto quickly, probably because the boy represented the last of his family. But Kakashi was still unsure of Kaoru's feelings towards his other teammates and, for that matter, towards Konoha. And yet, the boy was strong. Kakashi had seen him use that strength to save his teammates, including Kakashi himself. If the boy was a spy, he was doing a damn good job of hiding his intentions. Chapter 11. Itadakimasu. Sasuke glanced at the two boys across the table from him. It was at times like these, when both of them affected the same posture over their food with the same stupid smile plastered on their faces, that it was easy to see how Naruto and Kaoru were related. Most of the time, it was easier to see the differences. Between the difference in height and the hair color. Everything from the way they dressed down to their posture suggested that they held no similarities. But most of all, it was the eyes, Sasuke thought. There was something in Kaoru's eyes that Naruto was completely lacking. But it was only there sometimes, like it had been during the battle with Zabuza. And a few times when Kaoru had looked at Sasuke and called him Uchiha. "Ah, Kaoru-kun," Sakura called from beside him, setting her chopsticks down deliberately. "I was wondering. What was that jutsu you used to get out of Zabuza's water prison?" Sasuke leaned forward intently. That was another thing that made Kaoru different from Naruto. Kaoru was stronger. "Yeah, what did you do, Kaoru-ni-san?" Naruto mumbled around his mouthful of rice. "Your arm went all whoosh." He waved his arms about wildly to demonstrate, nearly knocking over the bowl in front of him. Kaoru deftly hooked one finger into Naruto's bowl to keep it from spilling. The older boy had an amused smile on his face as he turned to his younger cousin. "Whoosh," he repeated dubiously. "We're gonna work on your vocabulary, Daki." "How did you break the water prison?" asked Sasuke, determined to get the conversation back on track. Kaoru's expression grew serious as he gazed back at Sasuke. "I didn't," the older boy said shortly, "I cut it." Sasuke frowned and thought. That was a principle of elemental chakra, if he remembered Iruka's academy lectures correctly. Of the 5 elements that were associated with chakra, wind and lightning could both be sculpted into something resembling a blade. "With your arms?" Naruto was still confused. Not that his state of confusion surprised Sasuke. The Dobi had never paid attention in the academy. The sarcastic thought made Sasuke wonder briefly how Naruto had graduated in the first place. "It's a form of elemental chakra," explained Kaoru. "Everyone has it. Fire, water, earth, lightning. Same names as the 5 biggest nations. I'm wind." Sasuke shoved his bowl of rice away. He wasn't hungry at the moment, which might have something to do with being forced to watch Naruto inhale his rice the same way he did his ramen. "Tsunami-san, can I get another bowl for Kakashi-sensei?" Kaoru stood and approached the woman at the small stove within the one room that served as both kitchen and dining room in the small house. Naruto leaned over the table and snatched Sasuke's discarded bowl, pulling it towards him with a vengeance. Of course, the dark-haired woman responded, not seeing the blonde bottomless pit still at her table. Is he alright? He will be, answered Kaoru confidently. He reached out and took the new bowl from her. Thanks. Ya know, if Tazuna's worried about money, he could always pay us in rice. Kaoru turned toward the stairway that led upstairs, then he stopped suddenly, holding the bowl of rice in one hand while his free hand fisted against his stomach as he grimaced. Kaoru-kun? Sakura called. Naruto lifted his face from his new bowl of food, his cheeks stuffed with rice, before he swallowed hard, concern washing over his features. It's fine, Gaki, Kaoru interrupted before the boy could say anything. You can help me out later. Sasuke watched Naruto's concern fade into a reluctant kind of acceptance and wondered what could have made Naruto shut up so efficiently. The thought briefly flashed through his mind that he should learn that kind of technique, if only for the sake of his sanity. Why are you bothering? A small, dead voice asked before Sasuke could decide whether or not to comment on the scene before him. The three at the table plus the standing redhead turned to look at the owner of the voice. A short, barefooted boy with a large hat that covered nearly his entire head. Inari, these people are helping your grandfather, Tsunami reprimanded the boy hurriedly. You should thank them for coming. Naruto immediately sat up straighter, obviously expecting to be thanked or maybe even lauded. Sasuke was saved from having to scoff when the boy, Inari, just turned his back on the expectant room. Whatever, he declared in the same deadened voice. Hey! Naruto half rose from his seat as he stared indignantly at the retreating figure trudging up the stairs. Naruto, sit, Kaoru ordered firmly. Snapping his mouth shut, Naruto sank back to his knees at his place at Tsunami's low table. Sasuke stared at Kaoru, surprised at the older boy's sudden seriousness. Kaoru simply kept his eyes on Naruto. His brows knit together into a puzzled frown, and his mouth opened briefly before his teeth snapped together again with an audible click. Whatever Kaoru wanted to say, he was having trouble saying it. Suddenly, the older boy let out a huff of breath and turned away from the table. I'll be back, the redhead announced abruptly. He turned and headed for the stairs with the bowl of rice in his hand. Kakashi should be up and about in a day or two. We'll see where to go from there. Sasuke watched the older genin leave without noticing either Sakura's or Naruto's subdued looks. He had been curious about Kaoru's strengths ever since the older genin had sparred with him, teaching him something new even though Sasuke had been training since he was 6 years old. But the fact that Kaoru presumed to teach him didn't bother Sasuke as much as the fact that he could actually learn something from Kaoru. Kaoru was an older, redder version of Naruto. He was supposed to be a dobi, not a potential teacher. True to Kaoru's assessment, Kakashi was sitting up by the next day. Granted, he was still on the bedroll that had been set up for him in an upstairs room, but Kaoru considered it close enough since he hadn't really counted on the gaping hole in Kakashi's side when he made his prediction. Currently, he and his team were sitting on the floor, listening to Kakashi order them to continue guarding Tazuna at home. Tazuna, who was sitting across from Kakashi, looked very pleased at the idea that he still had his slew of protectors. As soon as Kakashi was fully recovered, he would join them at the bridge while Tazuna worked to finish his project. However, Kaoru was barely listening to the orders. Kakashi hadn't said a word about the hunter Nen, who was really Haku even if no one knew it yet, actually being an ally of Zabuza, and Kaoru was in the midst of wondering exactly how to call attention to that fact without calling attention to the fact that he knew it when no one else did. Kaoru? Kakashi called Kaoru on his inattention before a plan could fully form. Kaoru looked up and shrugged. It didn't matter, really. He had always been good at making stuff up on the fly. Something's been bothering me, he admitted truthfully. Gadu should have known by now that Zabuza got killed trying to kill Tazuna. Why hasn't anyone else come after us? You're expecting another attack, Sasuke translated. Kaoru almost rolled his eyes at his rival before he remembered that Sasuke wasn't his rival any longer. Besides, he was a bit worried that Zabuza would report that there were 2 Konoha shinobi on this mission that were able to fight him. Then, Gadu would send out someone else to get the job done, worried that 2 serious opponents would be one too much for Zabuza while worrying about 3 green genin. Once Gadu hears that Zabuza died against a bunch of genin, who's he gonna send next? Kaoru settled for scoffing. Hoshigaki Kisame. Huh? Naruto threw a confused glance at his cousin. Another Mizu missing Nen, elaborated Kaoru hurriedly. On second thought, maybe he shouldn't have listed a future Akatsuki member as the next on Gatu's list. He didn't even know if Gadu knew about Kisame, or if Kakashi did for that matter was the first guy that came to mind, given his and Zabuza's common fondness for giant swords and pointy teeth. But we didn't kill Zabuza, Sakura protested. That hunter Nen did. I didn't check the pulse. Kakashi spoke for the first time into the ensuing conversation. His uncovered eyes stared at the wall to his side, giving the impression that he wasn't really addressing anyone in particular. What? Now Naruto was frowning at his sensei. Does it matter? Kaoru asked, knowing that it did. That hunter Nen seemed pretty eager to take the body away to dispose. Kaoru stopped short, finally recognizing Kakashi's attentive one-eyed gaze as his sensei patiently waiting for his students to come to the conclusion that he had already found. "Oh, shit," Keiru murmured, mostly because he was afraid that Kakashi had realized that Keiru knew more than he pretended to. Indeed, Kakashi just nodded at Keiru's sudden bout of swearing. What? Naruto was obviously getting exasperated by now. Sakura's brows were knitted together as if she was in the midst of puzzling something out, and Tazuna waited suspiciously for further explanation. Keiru put his fears of stupid, smart, observant Junin sensei on hold to look at the boy he had claimed as family. Hunter nin aren't supposed to carry dead bodies around, he explained the same way he did most things with Naruto. There's a greater chance that someone will attack them to get to the secrets of the dead ninja. They're supposed to destroy missing nin on the spot. This hunter nin didn't. Kakashi continued the explanation thoughtfully. Also, he used senbon. Why senbon? Sakura asked with a frown. Keiru glanced at Kakashi, hoping that the Junin would answer so that Keiru wasn't expected to. He felt like he was already walking a dangerous line with how much information he had already blurted out. Tazuna looked a little lost with all the ninja shop talk, but Keiru wasn't worried about the super bridge builder. He was worried about the man who knew both namikaze Minato and uzumaki Naruto and who still didn't trust Keiru. Senbon are a precise weapon. The sensei shifted and laid one hand on his wounded side. If you aim right, you can pierce a person's jugular. Or, you can just hit a cluster of nerves that will make him go into a death-like coma for a while. What? Sakura was first to voice her realization of the point that Kakashi was trying to make and Keiru had already known. That's right, Kakashi confirmed calmly. There's a good chance that Zabuza's still alive. In the silence that followed Kakashi's announcement, Keiru cast his eyes around the room. Tazuna, unsurprisingly, looked darn close to panicked, while Sasuke was taking in the new development with the same stoicism Keiru had seen on that face 100 times before. Only the face seemed too young to look that dead to the world. Beside the dark boy, Naruto had a look of sheer anticipation. Even his body followed suit, his muscles trembling slightly with barely contained energy. So, what now? Keiru felt safe enough to ask. He wasn't about to offer any more information that he might not be expected to know, but he needed to keep the mission going. Since Zabuza likely still has his contract with Gato, he'll be coming back. Kakashi neglected his wounded side to glance over his young team. You all will have to get stronger before then, that means training. Training, huh? Naruto confirmed eagerly, sounds like fun. Keiru resisted the urge to roll his eyes. Naruto wouldn't appreciate it, but he wondered if Kakashi suspected just how difficult this mission would get for his genin. Obviously, he knew what Zabuza was capable of, but how had Kakashi ever thought a few days of tree climbing would prepare a team of genin to meet the demon of the mist? That's not fun. The flat voice that sounded far too young for its sentiment echoed Keiru's internal doubts. The redhead recognized the boy even before he peered over his shoulder at the young figure just inside the doorway of the room. Tsunami accompanied the boy, completing the small, makeshift family. Inari, Tazuna called in a much happier tone than his face had shown a moment before. He held out one arm to beckon the kid to his side and turned to Kakashi in explanation. This is my grandson. Keiru remembered the boy. Inari was even younger than Konohamaru, but both were the closest things Naruto had ever had to little brothers. Both looked up to him before anyone else had seen anything but a human container for a monstrosity. But now, Inari was still despondent, clinging to his grandfather as if he were still in mourning. Tsunami hovered in the doorway and muttered a reprimand at her son for being so impolite. Then, Inari turned his cheerless eyes to his audience. But, Mom, no one can win against Gato. Inari's gaze sifted over all four of Kakashi's students before he decided Keiru would be the easiest target. You're going to die. Keiru flinched before he could think about his involuntary reaction. He hadn't really thought about his death sentence since they had left Konoha. His seals were still paining him, if not a little less regularly now, and Keiru doubted that the brief reprieve was enough to stop the degradation of his chakra coils and eventually his inner organs. But Inari knew nothing about that. Not even Naruto did. Inari, Tazuna muttered to get the kid to shut up. Naruto straightened, indignant, and shoved his thumb into his chest. Hey, remember this, kid, he demanded in a voice that fully expected to be obeyed only because no one would listen unless he made them. I'm Uzumaki Naruto, future Hokage of Konoha and hero of the leaf. There's no way I'm gonna die from some bully like Gato. Inari continued his deadpan look at Naruto's obvious enthusiasm. What are you, stupid? He suddenly demanded. There's no such thing as a hero. Ignoring his grandfather's protests, Inari shrugged off the arm around him and trudged out of the room, only pausing in the doorway to the upper level. I'm going to look at the ocean from my room, the boy announced in the same flat voice. He had everything and left without further preamble. Keiru's calm eyes followed the boy up the stairs, but he didn't say anything. He was still stuck on the fact that Inari probably didn't even know how right his prediction was. Keiru was going to die. Naruto, however, was not finished. Why that little, hey, Karu called, a bit dazed from being pulled from his thoughts so suddenly. Naruto didn't even listen to his protest as he trumped after the insulting figure. Karu didn't chase after him. Naruto would do what he wanted, and Inari had turned out alright the first time around. Occasionally, even Karu had to admit that Naruto said the right thing. Not that he could ever remember what the right thing had been except for that one time, his promise of a lifetime. What kind of training are we doing? Sasuke demanded, eager for only that which would make him stronger. You'll see, Kakashi replied happily. Maybe even Karu-kun can benefit from this. Great. Kakashi was doing that one-eye smile thing again. That all-known no-worries smile never meant anything good for any of Kakashi's students, present or future. Karu sighed heavily and braced himself for a day of walking up and down trees until Copy Nin Hitaki was satisfied that Karu was a genin and not a threat to his team. Momochi Zabuza did not like to be reliant on others. Ever since the Seven Swordsmen of the Mist had disbanded, he had been on his own, and he preferred to keep it that way. No one to betray him, no one to take advantage of his secrets. Not that Zabuza had many secrets, but there was a reason he was considered Nuke Nen by the Mizukage. The assassination attempt did nothing to endear him to the Water Country's shinobi leader. Strangely enough, Zabuza never considered the boy seated in a chair at the foot of his bed as a dependent or a crutch. Haku was a tool. Nothing more. If nothing else, Zabuza could trust the boy to be absolutely loyal to him, if only Bede found him. But being independent also came with a drawback. Because Zabuza wasn't a part of any shinobi village, he had to create his own economy. Being a killer for hire wasn't really a great profession unless one lived to kill. Zabuza called himself a demon, but he had a loftier goal than simply killing the strong. He was going to kill the strongest man in Kirigakure. But in the meantime, he was forced to take jobs from men who wouldn't survive 10 seconds against a true shinobi. Hell, even those green Konoha genin could make short work of the man who was currently leering at Zabuza. So, even you have come back defeated, Gadu sneered. It looks like Kiri Nin are pretty pathetic. Zabuza was sure that he was far from intimidating in his current position horizontal in a bed, looking for all the world as if he had no sense or feeling in his limbs. Hardly the picture of a feared assassin. You can't even avenge your men, and you call yourself a devil? Gadu's cane tapped against the wooden floor as he inched closer to the bed. Don't make me laugh. Zabuza paid no attention to the jibe. The demon brothers weren't his men. They never had been. Gadu was mistaking a shared heritage for a reason for camaraderie. The siblings had simply been shinobi ousted from their village and in need of employment. Zabuza had taken them on this job initially because he wanted as little contact with Gadu as possible. With an old man as the target, not even a ninja but a simple architect, the demon of the mist didn't think his presence would be required. That had obviously changed when the demon brothers had been found in the forest near the coastline of Hai no Kuni with their throats cut in an efficient kill. A slight change of tension in the still air within the room caught Zabuza's attention even before his eye caught the movement of Waraji's hand at his sword. He and his companion, Zori, fancied themselves samurai, but they were nothing more than koban with fancy swords. Zabuza found them annoying, but he would have to pay attention if they were planning an attack. On a wounded man. No less. How very unlike the noble samurai they pretended to be. But a word from Gadu stilled their blades before they could make a move. Hey, there's no need to stay silent. Gadu advanced on Zabuza's prone form and stretched out one hand to the wounded ninja. Beneath the cover that hid his movement, Zabuza curled his fingers carefully around the kunai beside him. He wasn't at his full potential quite yet, but he could easily take care of someone like Gadu. How about? Gadu began snidely then suddenly found himself cut off when a stronger, smoother hand than his grasped his wrist with surprisingly strength. Don't touch Zabuza-sama with your dirty hands, Haku ordered coldly, twisting the old wrist firmly. Zabuza wouldn't deny that he found the grimace of pain that appeared on Gatu's features sadistically satisfying. Brat, Waraji bit out. His hand came down to his sword even as he started forward with Zori at his side. The two fake samurai didn't even have time to draw their swords before Haku positioned himself between Gatu's guards. His hands were on the samurai's suddenly missing swords, and Waraji and Zori stood frozen with their own blades at their throats. You shouldn't do that, warned the boy, finally looking just as dangerous as he actually was instead of the soft figure he usually appeared as. I'm in a bad mood right now. Zabuza refused to feel pride at the boy's show of skill. It was only right that he defended his master, after all, and Zabuza would never have a weak tool. Gadu shook with the force of the sake radiating from Haku and turned abruptly. One more time, the man snapped. Zabuza could almost see him trying to gather his wits again. If you fail one more time, you won't be welcome here anymore. Remember that. Zabuza almost scoffed at the threat that was hardly a threat. He hadn't been welcome anywhere for a long time. Being kicked out of Nami no Kuni with the threat of death upon returning wouldn't be anything new for the Nuke Nen. Haku released the swords in his hands, and Gatu's cronies scrambled to recompose their threatening appearance and hurry after their boss. You didn't have to do that, Haku, Zabuza reminded the boy as soon as he could no longer sense the overt presence of their three visitors. I know, Zabuza-sama. Haku's visage was once again calm and soft. He turned and retook his chair at the foot of the bed. But it's too early to kill Gato. If we cause a commotion, they will be after us again. We must be patient. Yes. If Kiri got wind that Zabuza was operating so close to Mizu no Kuni, they might send a real hunter nin out for him. That would be harder to avoid than Haku in a borrowed mask. Zabuza turned to the boy again, reminded of his initial insurance policy when he had first discovered exactly who had killed the demon brothers. You saw the leaf shinobi. His eyes were sharp on Haku's uncovered face. Yes, agreed Haku. The three youngest are genin and not well trained yet, the other two. I didn't think Hitaki Kakashi would be here, Zabuza admitted when Haku trailed away. I may have to kill him. Hitaki Kakashi, the copy nin of Konoha, could be a dangerous opponent if led to be. Once Zabuza had had his undivided attention, Hitaki had been able to copy all of Zabuza's most powerful water jutsu without any preparation. He only needed to look at Zabuza to know what the demon would do. He would be a problem. The genin were annoying brats at best. Zabuza had underestimated their creativity and lost a bush into them, but it was easily dismissed. It was the redhead that Zabuza wondered about. He was a decent fighter, and he obviously had some knowledge of Kiri nin, maybe even of Zabuza himself. That wind jutsu had been strong enough to stab through his water prison and force him to release the jutsu and avoid a fatal blow. Do you know the other one? He demanded of his companion. Haku was usually good with information. Since no one had any records of him outside of his hometown, he could easily infiltrate a place and gather intelligence on its people or its allies. He might know something about this teenager who seemed too strong to be a genin, at least by Konoha standards. No, answered Haku. He was also young. The statement might have been an explanation or an excuse on Haku's part. Although genin teams usually came in threes, it wasn't unheard of for more ninja to gather for missions. Not that young. Zabuza had been even younger when he had gone through his graduation exam, and Haku had been a child when Zabuza first came upon the boy chained by the neck to a fence and left for dead. He could be dangerous. He dropped the kunai in his hand back onto the sheets of the bed and rested his head against the pillow. Keep an eye on them, he commanded. Don't worry about Gadu. Zabuza wasn't concerned about Gadu. He was nothing more than an overgrown bully, and Zabuza was planning on killing the man, anyway. The money would be well worth it, not to mention the fact that he had a reputation to uphold. What kind of demon let himself be hired by a man who was so easily scared away by a little quickness from a boy? Why are we doing this again? Naruto frowned at the tree in front of him. Unless Kakashi-sensei expected Zabuza to send trees to attack them, Naruto wasn't sure what good they were doing. Even though Zabuza's alive, he'll take some time to recover from his temporary paralysis, answered Kakashi from his place behind the three genin, leaning on a pair of crutches for support while Keiru stood beside him, just in case. You guys are gonna get stronger before then. How? Demanded Sasuke. Kakashi's eyes crinkled into a hidden smile. You're going to climb trees, the Junin announced. Naruto scowled. Climbing trees was hardly training. He had done it plenty of times when he was a kid, but they were ninja now. Kakashi couldn't really expect them to get stronger by. Without hands, Gaki, Keiru suddenly interrupted Naruti's mouth could even form the protest already racing through his brain. Naruto cocked his head slightly at his older brother figure and tried to puzzle out his words. You mean like you did on the side of the building that time? He pointed at Keiru rudely. But Keiru never seemed to mind Naruto's lack of manners. And Keiru did say that he was going to teach him how to defy gravity sometime. They just hadn't gotten to it before the mission. Ah, then you already know this exercise, Keiru-kun. Kakashi turned to his helper cheerfully. Would you demonstrate? I'm not fully recovered yet. Naruto watched interestedly as Keiru nodded and calmly approached the tree that Naruto faced. Keiru walked up the tree horizontally, much like Naruto had seen him do on the side of the apartment building, until he stood upside down on the underside of a high branch. He tipped his head up so that he was gazing upside down at the adolescents on the ground. You focus chakra to your feet, explained Keiru. That allows you to pretty much stick to the tree. Eventually, you'll be able to do it on water, too, like on the lake. Naruto burst into a wide grin at the thought of the surprise battle on the way to their destination. It had been scary, and Naruto wouldn't deny that in the innermost portion in his mind. But never to Sasuke's face. But watching Keiru-ni and Kakashi-sensei beat Zabuza's ass while practically dancing on the surface of the water had been awesome. Really? Naruto's eyes focused on Keiru as the redhead started walking back down the trunk. Cool. Let's focus on the tree first, instructed Kakashi calmly from behind his team. Resting one hand on his crutches, he withdrew 3 kunai with the other and launched them at the ground with a flick of his wrist. Use those to mark your progress. It's best if you try to get a running start. Naruto set his jaw and picked up the knife-like blade in front of him, then turned back to the tree that Keiru was just stepping away from. The older boy caught Naruto's eye and winked once. Naruto's rigidity of determination turned into a cheeky grin. He could do this. Unfortunately, reality came crashing in about the same time as gravity decided that Uzumaki Naruto wasn't quite ready to break all its laws and yanked Naruto off the tree trunk and onto his back after only 1 meter of running. From his place on the flat of his back, trying to catch his breath, Naruto glanced around at his teammates. Sasuke had gotten higher than he had, slashing the tree with a skinny mark about twice as far off the ground as Naruto knew he had gotten. But the trunk below Sasuke's mark was littered with deep indentations in the shape of footprints. Sasuke knelt in front of his own tree, glaring at it as if he were deciding the best method to burn it to the ground. A small part, well, a majority, actually, of Naruto silently crowed that Sasuke seemed to be as frustrated as he was. But Naruto still couldn't see Sakura-chan anywhere. "Hey, this isn't so hard," a light voice suddenly cried out. Naruto looked up. It was easy since he was already on his back. Sakura sat on a thin branch high above them all, even higher than Kaoru had climbed to demonstrate. She squinted at the party below her and stuck out her tongue a little bit like a 5-year-old kid who had one-upped everyone else. "Well, it seems Sakura is the best at chakra control," Kakashi announced from the ground, which means that she's closest to becoming Hokage, unlike a certain someone. Naruto scrambled to his feet and shot a glare at Kakashi. Then again, everyone made fun of his dreams, so why should his sensei be any different from the rest of them? And it looks like the Uchiha clan doesn't amount to much, either. Kakashi turned his single eye onto Sasuke. "Sensei," Sakura cried, reprimanding from the tree. Naruto just smiled smugly at the thought that his rival hadn't escaped a put down either. But a loud chuckle distracted him, and Naruto turned curiously to where his cousin had his head tilted back as he laughed long and loud. "Go, Sakura-chan," Kaoru called proudly. "Way to beat the boys." Sakura just hung her head as her cheeks worked on turning the same color as her hair. Naruto's smile slowly fell, and he faced his tree again, picking up the kunai where he had dropped it as soon as he had hit the ground. He was going to get this. The future Hokage of Konoha was not about to be outdone by a tree. "You'll get it, Gaki." The voice surprisingly echoed Naruto's own thoughts. When Naruto glanced over his shoulder, Kaoru looked back at him with his crooked kind of half smile. "You're not using enough chakra. Try harder. Just not as hard as Teme there." Kaoru's head jerked towards Sasuke. He used too much. Naruto looked over Sasuke's tree again and noted the deep footprints. So, not that much chakra, but more than he was using now. Naruto nodded firmly. He could do that. "Well, you'll be practicing this for the rest of the day," announced Kakashi. "Kaoru-kun?" Kakashi limped his way around to head back to Tazuna's place. "I'll stick around, Kakashi-sensei." Kaoru laced his fingers together and braced his hands behind his head. "Ya no, keep an eye on the Gaki." Naruto paused in examining his tree to glance back at Kaoru gratefully. He and Kaoru hadn't been able to spend much time together, alone, on the mission, but it was still Naruto's responsibility to take care of his cousin like he had last night when he painted over the seals on Kaoru's arms. Kaoru had said that the battle with Zabuza had aggravated them, that his chakra didn't want to be gathered right when it needed to be. Naruto didn't know much about chakra, so he didn't know how to fix Kaoru. And he didn't dare ask Kaoru if he knew anyone who would be able to. Kakashi left without protest, at least not any that Naruto heard, but he was a little busy pumping chakra into the soles of his feet and running straight for a very immobile target. By the time Naruto hit the ground again, Kakashi was gone and Kaoru was sitting on the forest floor, leaning back against a tree with his arms behind his head. Satisfied with his audience, Naruto went back to the tree. It was a few more hours before Naruto got frustrated. Sakura-chan had been long since walking calmly up and down the tree while trying not to attract too much attention to herself. He and Sasuke, however, were still charging at the tree trunks, which were now scarred beyond recognition with kunai slashes marring the bark all the way up. And still, Naruto was only pulling dead even with Sasuke. Naruto pulled a face at his tree, just to make himself feel better, then started towards Kaoru. "Hey, Kaoru ni," Naruto called, ignoring his teammates. Kaoru was still sitting under his tree, but now he stared into the forest thoughtfully. At Naruto's call, he obediently turned blue eyes to meet their matches in Naruto's earnest face. "Gimme a hint," commanded the younger genin. "A hint?" Kaoru repeated. "How to do this," Naruto clarified with a frown. "I gotta get stronger than Sasuke." "No, you don't." Naruto jerked out of his reverie and made to protest before he realized exactly what Kaoru meant. Sasuke was still climbing his tree behind Naruto, and Naruto was losing. "Sasuke's your teammate, Gaki." Kaoru frowned at the boy before him. "You get stronger with him, not against him." Naruto's mouth twisted with the urge to pout. He wasn't meaning to actually fight with Sasuke, but Sasuke was a bastard and a jerk on top of that. Naruto couldn't lose to him, and he refused to give Sasuke any reason to look down on him. Kaoru suddenly sat up straighter and motioned Naruto to come closer. "There are different types of strength, you know," he postulated. A ninja can be strong here, here, or here. He tapped Naruto's biceps, brain, and chest. Just over his heart. All in order. Molding chakra means combining the spiritual and the physical. His calloused fingers went back to touch Naruto's heart and muscles as he named them. Then, Keiru looked back into Naruto's wide eyes. That's where you're strongest. Arched Keiru's gaze wide-eyed, scanning for any signs of joking or teasing. But his cousin was all sincerity. Yeah, responded Keiru quietly. Don't ever give up, Naruto, and never go back on your word. Maybe someday I'll get to see you be a great ninja. Naruto's heart leapt inside his chest, and suddenly he couldn't stop smiling. He walked back to face the tree that had his marks crawling slowly upwards, ignoring the break that Sasuke was taking to talk to Sakura. Naruto was determined to get as good as Keiru, maybe even better. He would prove that there were still heroes in the world. After all, he had one for his cousin. Chapter 12. Sakura stretched her arms high above her head and yawned wide enough to pop the right side of her jaw. After a full day of walking up and down the trunk of a tree while Sasuke and Naruto both struggled to catch up to what she had accomplished the first try, Sakura found herself exhausted but too sore to sleep well. She swiped at the moisture that had gathered in her eyes from her intake of oxygen and pried her eyes back open. Are we making ya work too hard, Sakura-chan? She could hear the wide grin in the voice without even looking at the redhead who had issued the taunt. But she stuck her tongue out childishly at Keiru anyway. Well, climbing trees all day is tiring, she protested with a smile from her perch sitting on a large wooden crate. She wasn't sure what it held, but it made for a good vantage point. Keiru flashed her a final grin before he turned away with a long plank balanced on one shoulder. Two other figures, identical to her teammate down to the fingerless gloves he often wore, were helping two of the bridge workers to lift a wooden slate of square stone blocks. Are you sure it's all right for you to be here, Sakura-chan? Tazuna interjected. Sakura briefly wondered if she should protest everyone insisting on calling her Sakura-chan. Maybe it had started with Naruto's stupid belief that if he called her in such a familiar manner, she would actually agree to go on a date with him. Then his cousin picked up the habit. Although Sakura had to admit that it sounded a little less annoying coming from someone several years older than her. It's fine, Tazuna-san, she replied happily. Kakashi-sensei said that since I've already mastered the training we're doing, I should come here with Keiru-kun to protect you. What about the other two boys? Tazuna frowned beneath his wide hat. Still training, Keiru grunted as he tossed the wooden plank down to the bare, half-completed bridge near the end that abruptly dropped off into the foggy water below. But Kakashi said that assassin was still alive, protested the bridge builder. Zabuza's not gonna attack yet, Keiru stated firmly, as if that ended the argument then and there. He turned back to his audience and tugged at his gloves, securing them against his palms. Besides, I got a clone with Naruto and Sasuke, and Kakashi's still at the house. He grinned widely again. The only trouble they're gonna get into is with each other. Sakura smiled back at him as he stooped to pick up another board, transferring it to the unfinished end of the bridge. Keiru was always friendly to her. She was a little concerned at his eagerness to work so hard so soon after the battle, especially when Kakashi-sensei was still limping around on crutches. But Keiru had assured her several times that his injuries weren't nearly as bad as the Junin's. And except for that brief moment of pain in Tsunami's kitchen, Sakura hadn't seen any lingering effects of his wounds. A timid man in a wide hat much like Tazuna's distracted Sakura when he approached the old man. Tazuna-san, can I talk to you? The man inquired quietly. His skin looked weathered in a way that years of living near salt water and sea winds could always accomplish, and deep lines ran along the edges of his eyes, making him look perpetually tired. Yeah, Gichi. Tazuna slapped the younger man on the shoulder happily. Gichi didn't seem to return Tazuna's upbeat sentiment. He glanced at his feet and swallowed hard with Sakura and Keiru looking on curiously. Tazuna, have you considered that you should stop building this bridge? Gichi questioned with a sense of deadened finality. What? Snapped Tazuna in a suddenly low tone. Sakura's eyes were quick enough to catch Gichi's flinch at the demand for explanation. She noticed that Keiru had frozen as well with a long plank of wood on one shoulder and his eyes firmly fixed on Gichi. I know I started working on this bridge with you, Gichi started to explain, and we've been close for a long time. You know I want to help you, but Gadu will notice as soon. This is pointless if you lose your life over it. Tazuna's face fell into a quiet kind of solemnity. Sakura suddenly wondered if the old man was considering how close he came to walking back to his home alone after lying to Shinobi. If Kakashi-sensei had opted to take their team back to Konoha, there would have been no one left on the road to protect Tazuna from Zabuzu's attack. I can't do that, Tazuna answered with his eyes downcast. This bridge is our bridge. This is the bridge we started building together, believing it would bring resources into our super poor country. But if we lose our lives, shouted Gichi, determined to get in one more protest. That's enough, Tazuna announced in a much louder voice than he had been using moments before. Let's stop for lunch. Tazuna turned his back to the suddenly silent Gichi and motioned Keiru to put down his load. Gichi, the older man began in a quiet tone, you don't have to come back tomorrow. Sakura slowly lowered herself from her perch on top of the crate, keeping her eyes on Gichi's shocked look for a moment. A slight popping sound she had come to recognize ever since being placed on Team 7 made Sakura look to where Keiru's 2 clones were reduced to a couple pillars of smoke. Keiru himself knelt on the bride and let down the plank in his arms gently. Your kid's got quite a legacy, old man, muttered the redhead without looking at his audience. You're brave enough to stand up to Gato. Sakura glanced at Tazuna's surprisingly lack of reaction, other than a simple lift of his shoulders, before she looked back at Keiru. But Keiru didn't seem to expect a reaction or a response. He just straightened into a stand and watched the foggy expanse of sea that hid the mainland of Hai no Kuni from view. Keiru-kun? Sakura questioned gently. Keiru looked over his shoulder quickly and flashed the girl a reassuring grin. It was so hard to tell what Keiru was thinking most of the time. In fact, now that Sakura thought about it, he talked about his past about as much as Sasuke-kun did. But the difference was that Keiru didn't hesitate to reassure his friends that he was alright. Keiru turned and followed Tazuna off the bridge slowly as all the other workers slowly dissipated, making their way home for lunch before work on the bridge would start once again. Keiru had forgotten how bad Nami no Kuni really was under Gato. He remembered, of course, that Gato had made everyone's lives miserable, especially Tazuna's family. But he hadn't really expected that worker to up and quit his work on the bridge when it was their greatest hope. He hadn't expected the cold, dead look on the adults as he walked with Tazuna and Sakura through the village. His head turned to follow a young man who passed them, holding a handwritten sign. We'll work for food. Briefly, Keiru wondered if he should suggest to Tazuna that the kid, hardly older than Keiru, should be Gichi's replacement on the bridge. Tazuna dully announced that he had to stop at the market to bring home some more food for Tsunami and the family. With his hands shoved in his pockets, Keiru watched the man pick over the meager choices on display in the store. There was rice, as always, but barely any fruit and only the most common vegetables. The store was even almost out of miso. Pervert. A sudden high scream jerked Keiru's head around just in time to see Sakura slam her foot into a middle-aged man's face. Despite feeling very sorry for the recipient of Sakura's temper, the edges of Keiru's mouth twitched with the task of repressing his smile. Sakura-chan, that guy wasn't a pervert, he announced when the man fled the vengeful kunoichi. He was trying to grab me. Sakura's death glare, which had always been much hotter than Sasuke's, turned full force onto Keiru. He was aiming for your bag, explained Keiru as Tazuna paid for his small bag of groceries. He's a pickpocket. Probably trying to get some money for food. Sakura's frown suddenly melted into a shenshin. Oh, she murmured quietly. Keiru fell silent and followed Tazuna out of the store with Sakura trailing behind, still looking downcast. Keiru glanced back at her occasionally as the trio headed down the main street on their way out of town. He forgot sometimes that none of his current teammates had seen the things he had. He was so used to looking to Sakura for rationale or even for one sole person who believed that things could still work out according to her teammates' promises because her friend would never go back on his word. Even before the last battle with Kisame had inflicted wounds that no one but the late Godem Hokage could heal, Sakura had believed that her last teammate would find a way. He would bring Konoha back to what it was because it was his home. Keiru-kun. Sakura's call quickly brought Keiru back out of memories of a red dress stained with a darker red that had never looked right on her. He lifted his head enough to look back at her while still trying to shake off the feeling that she looked far too young. Would you help me with my offense? Pleaded the cherry blossom with her fingers tightening into each other. Huh? Keiru frowned and wondered for a moment why Sakura was so worried when she had already completed Kakashi's training. Then the vocabulary popped back into his mind. Offense. Oh, I'm sorry about what I said, Sakura. Keiru rubbed the back of his head sheepishly. I didn't mean to. I know you're strong, Sakura-chan. I just thought you could be stronger than that. Hell, he knew that Sakura could be stronger than that, but he also knew that he couldn't teach her what she was best at. He was shit at medical jutsu. You got great chakra control, Sakura-chan. Even better than Sasuke and Naruto, he explained, knowing she would connect that into the training Kakashi had explained. So, she knew it wasn't just Keiru saying it to make her feel better. Girls usually do. Might be why they make great Iryo nin. Medical nin, Sakura repeated. Keiru nodded, trying not to look too excited that she had picked up the topic of interest. He began then suddenly stopped in realization that he wasn't supposedly from his home village anymore. Well, easy to fix. In Whirlpool, every 3-man team was assigned an Iryo nin. That had been Tsunade's idea, and the reason that both Ino and Hinata learned so many medical techniques in addition to their own family jutsu. At least, they were supposed to. We ran short sometimes. But it helped teams in the field stay alive. They were out of town by now, walking along the tree-lined dirt road to Tazuna's house. Keiru scanned the forest around him, just in case. Zabuza would still be out of commission, but Haku most definitely was not. Kaoru remembered that the boy didn't actually show up until morning, not that he could remember which morning. Maybe Kaoru could find him before that. Haku and Naruto really could have become friends, and dang if Naruto couldn't use a few more for himself. "Kaoru-kun?" Sakura called again. "Were you ever a sensei?" The question took Kaoru by surprise, and he had to blink several times before he could form an answer. "No," he finally said shortly. "There was this kid that used to follow me around, but..." His blue eyes fell to the ground at the memory of Konohamaru. The stupid kid had stood up to Pain's demand that Konoha release Uzumaki Naruto, the last of the Jinchuriki, to Akatsuki. Kaoru would have been a terrible sensei. He hadn't been in time to save Konohamaru, but Kakashi had died protecting his students, just another way he had followed his longtime rival. "He's going to kill himself like this," Sakura murmured worriedly, pushing her cropped hair away from her face. "How many did he say he was going to do?" Ino inquired from beside her. 1,500 one-handed push-ups if Guy-sensei didn't make it. Sakura's tone dropped at the mention of Konoha's green beast. Ino paused and glanced into the hospital's small courtyard. It was still a bit trashed from Akatsuki's attack, and repairs were going on around them while the med nin tried to save everyone they could. But with Tsunade herself injured, Sakura, Ino, and the others were fighting an uphill battle. Not to mention trying to take care of stubborn patients like Rock Lee, who is currently on push-up number 127. "Shouldn't we stop him?" Ino turned in desperation to where Neji sat in a chair, crutches beside him and a cast encasing his right leg from ankle to thigh. "You won't be able to," Neji replied blandly. Sakura opened her mouth to suggest something else when a bright figure nudged his way past her and into the courtyard. "Naruto, what are you doing?" she demanded. "You're not recovered yet." Naruto ignored Sakura's protests and approached the sweating, trembling Lee. Without a word, Naruto crouched down and spread himself beside Lee, who paused in his exercise long enough to gaze solemnly at his friend. "Naruto-kun, please do not try to deter me," he commanded breathlessly. "I have sworn that I would perform 1,500 push-ups with one hand if my beloved sensei was unable to recover from his injuries. I must complete this task, and you shall not." 128, murmured Naruto, pushing his body off the ground with his left hand while he kept his broken right arm tucked into his chest. "Naruto-kun?" Lee frowned and watched Naruto repeat the performance. 129. Sakura's mouth hung open in the midst of a silent protest. "Great, now we got two stubborn idiots," grumbled Ino. Her caustic tone was betrayed by the small crack in her voice. "Sakura, go talk to him." Sakura swallowed hard and shook her head, dislodging the tears that had gathered in her eyes. "Naruto blames himself," she whispered. Any louder and her voice might crack as well. "He won't stop until he counts all of them." 131. The two injured ninja called out in chorus. Each determined to make it to the end, one to honor his sensei and one to pay for the man's death. "Do you have any scrolls on medical jutsu, Kaoru-kun?" inquired Sakura curiously. Kaoru swallowed and shook his head quickly, trying to make his body forget about the task of performing 1,373 push-ups in one day. He frowned confusedly at the young kunoichi walking beside him. "Scrolls," Sakura repeated. "From Whirlpool. Now, that was an interesting thought." Wondering what kind of medical jutsu his mother's country could have had lightened Kaoru's thoughts enough to give Sakura a half-smile that turned only slightly reluctant. "Sorry, Sakura-chan," Kaoru apologized honestly. "Most everything I had before got burned before I left. Iruka-sensei might have some basics you can look at when we get back to Konoha." "I suppose the other two are going to be super hungry from working so hard," muttered Tazuna, neatly interrupting all ninja shop talk once again. "Actually, I doubt they'll be coming." Kaoru's half-smile turned into a grin. Naruto and Sasuke were both far too competitive to stop in the midst of trying to beat each other just to eat. Naruto would forget all about it in his single-minded approach to training, and Sasuke would never quite before the dead last did. "But they need to eat," Sakura protested in concern. "Don't worry." Kaoru just shrugged. "Maybe my clone can convince them to come in, but if they collapse, they'll just get dragged home, anyway." Sasuke launched himself away from the trunk of the tree as soon as he felt himself slipping and thrust one hand in front of him to catch the bark with his kunai. He used his momentum to flip backwards, arching his back in a smooth movement to end up landing on his feet, 1 yard away from the tree that held his slash marks up along the trunk. Glancing to his left, Sasuke saw that Naruto had progressed at least as far as he had. "Keep this up, and we'll need 2 more clones just to hoist you two up the tree." Sasuke ground his teeth together and glared at the interruption. But the RNED against the tree at his back with his arms crossed behind his head without concern, taking in the marks on both trees. Kakashi had sent Sakura with Tazuna for the day, with the intention of using Kaoru to watch Naruto and Sasuke in the forest, just in case Kaoru's prediction of another assassin taking Zabuza's place came true. But Kaoru had the unusual, annoying talent of being in 2 places at once. So, Keiru and Sakura both went into town to guard Tazuna while one Kage Bushin remained with the other two genin. Sasuke didn't know that much about Kage Bushin no Jutsu. It was a kinjutsu and thus not taught in any of the academy classes other than its mention as a highly dangerous jutsu because of the amount of chakra needed as well as something called sensory overload. But Keiru's shadow clone had remained with them all day, and, despite its strange speech patterns, it didn't show any signs of fading or becoming weaker. "How long did it take you to get this, Keiru ni?" Naruto panted and wiped his brow with the back of his arm. "Longer than you," was the redhead's amused answer. He smiled then glanced over at Sasuke. Defiantly, the Uchiha set his eyes back on his goal and ran towards the tree again. "You need some help?" Keiru rose to his feet as Sasuke fell back down to earth, this time landing somewhat less gracefully on one knee. "No," he answered shortly. "Fine, then." Keiru simply shoved his hands into his pockets and leaned his back against the tree again. Sasuke could still sense Keiru's calm, blue gaze on his back. Pressing his jaws together firmly, Sasuke shoved the feeling out of his mind. He had to concentrate on this training. He had to get stronger. Staring at the tree in front of him, Sasuke darted forward, all the while feeling a prickling sensation at the back of his neck that told him he was being watched. From the corner of his eye, he could see Naruto charge at his tree at the same time. Sasuke pumped an additional burst of chakra to his legs. He was not going to be outdone by the dobi. Sasuke felt his feet shoot off from the trunk almost immediately, as if he and the tree were opposite ends of a magnet that repelled each other. He lost his grip so quickly that he didn't have time to twist his body into a flip so that he could actually land on his feet. The most he could do was try to right himself in midair. Managing to get his feet under him was one thing, but balancing seemed to be out of his reach. Sasuke landed hard on his heels and started falling backwards. He could already predict what would happen. He was about to fall flat on his ass. But before he could tumble into such an embarrassing position, he felt a strong hand at his back, tipping him back into a standing position. "You're pushing it too hard," Keiru's voice came from behind him. Sasuke jerked away from the touch and spun around to glare at the older genin. "I don't need your help," he bit back. This was his struggle, his quest, his burden to bear. No one else could understand his ambition. Keiru just frowned at the dark-haired boy. "Do you want to get this or not?" demanded the redhead hotly. He calmed quickly and folded his arms across his chest. "You're thinking about it too much. When you walk and talk at the same time, you don't need to think about the walking, nay? You just put one foot in front of the other." Keiru took Sasuke by the shoulder and turned him around to face the scratched-up tree. "Don't think about this," he ordered, more quietly. "Just concentrate on how much chakra you're expelling. Always an equal amount from the soles of your feet." Sasuke's anger slid away slowly as he stared at the tree. He knew he needed to be calm to attempt this kind of chakra control, but Itachi was always at the forefront of his mind. He needed to be strong enough to avenge his family by killing the madman responsible for their deaths. But a small part of Sasuke responded to Keiru's calm instructions. Breathing deeply, the young Uchiha tightened his grip on the kunai in his hand and felt the familiar, tingling warmth that signaled his chakra traveling through his body. Suddenly, he ran. For a moment, Sasuke forgot about his movements, only concentrating on the warm feeling spreading through his feet. He ignored the sense of gravity pulling at him as he flew up the tree parallel to the ground. He barely registered his previous mark as he passed it and kept running, focused only on the tree and his own chakra. When he could feel his control slipping, Sasuke scratched a line in the trunk and flipped backwards. He sailed to the ground and landed easily, if not heavily, on his feet, caught unnecessarily by a pair of hands on his shoulders. "See, that was better." Sasuke glanced behind him to see Keiru beaming proudly at the tree before he turned his blue eyes to Sasuke. Sasuke grunted uncomfortably. "You're welcome, bastard." Keiru's smile remained on his face as if glued on, and he backed away from the boy. Sasuke turned away from his one-time instructor, ignoring a feeling that he hadn't felt in nearly 6 years growing in the pit of his stomach. "Iniki, will you teach me to throw shuriken today?" Sasuke swallowed back his memories of Itachi and tried to concentrate on the tree again. Surreptitiously, he glanced again at Keiru. The clone was laughing happily at something Naruto had done or said, his head thrown back and his mouth open wide. Sasuke frowned. Keiru was, at most, a distant relative of Naruto's who had suddenly appeared in Konoha. That didn't explain why Keiru sometimes treated him exactly the same way he treated Naruto. Like a little brother he was passing his knowledge on to. Naruto shoveled the last of the steamed rice into his mouth and swallowed what he could, but his cheeks still puffed out with the excess food. He glared across the table at Sasuke, satisfied that the bastard was still inhaling his bowl. The two had been eating constantly throughout supper while Tazuna, Tsunami, and Inari looked on. Well, Naruto thought Inari was looking, but it was hard to tell with that kid. The important thing was that Sasuke was falling behind. With his cheeks still full of food, Naruto quickly held up his empty bowl to demand another helping. Suddenly, another hand grabbed his wrist firmly and forced the bull back down to the table. Naruto glared at Kaoru, who was seated beside him propping his chin on his fist while his elbow balanced on the table. "You don't get more, Gaki," Kaoru ordered firmly. "I need more food," protested Naruto, mouth still full. He ignored the disgusted look that Sakura-chan shot his way as well as Kakashi-sensei's amused curve of his bare eye. "Gaki," Kaoru called, a warning without even saying his name. "I need to get stronger." Naruto just kept glaring. His cousin was going to make him lose to Sasuke. "Oi!" Kaoru lifted his head from its perch on his fist and leaned close to Naruto's stuffed face. "Swallow." Naruto shifted the masses of food stuffed in each of his cheeks and forced it down his throat. As soon as his mouth was empty, he went back to glaring at Kaoru defiantly. Then, he found it suddenly difficult to keep up such a serious expression. "Urglk." Naruto grunted and tried to tuck his head closer to his chest in an effort to shrink his stomach back to its regular size. Kaoru released the boy's wrist and leaned back to observe. "Told ya, Gaki." Naruto raised his head just enough to catch Keiru's half-smile, a distinct impression reverberating that his cousin was laughing at him. Naruto rolled his eyes and saw Sasuke across the table, looking more green than pale for once. A portion of Naruto's throat relaxed at the thought that Sasuke was faring just as well as him. "You idiot," snapped Sakura from Naruto's other side. "Don't waste good food like that." Naruto flinched in anticipation of Sakura's temper. Getting Sakura-chan mad at him was never a good idea. "Don't hit him, Sakura-chan," warned Kaoru with a wide smile. He might explode. Satisfied that the squeal that issued from Sakura meant that she wouldn't be socking him, Naruto rested table and tried not to move. Sasuke had his eyes closed and his head turned away. Naruto wondered if Sasuke would throw up. Then he could rub that in Sasuke's face, just not literally. But then his stomach curled at the thought of seeing, and smelling, anything that issued from Sasuke's stomach, and Naruto forgot about it. Tsunami gradually cleaned up around the two boys who were still trying desperately not to puke. Eventually, she set out cups of tea for Kakashi, Tazuna, and Kaoru. Naruto gingerly sat up and wondered if he could actually get to see Kakashi try to drink the tea with his face mask on. His stomach still felt unnaturally stretched, but at least he didn't have the urge to empty it anymore. "Tsunami-san, why is this picture torn?" Sakura called curiously. Inari-kun was staring at it during dinner. Naruto turned his head carefully. Sakura stood by the wall, gazing at a framed photo on the wall. He could just barely make out Tsunami and Inari in the picture, but the top right quarter of the photograph had been torn off, like Sakura said, was torn away. "That's a picture of one of this village's greatest heroes," Tazuna answered for Tsunami. Suddenly, Inari noisily got to his feet, kicking the table in the process and jarring Naruto's chin, and consequently stomach. "Inari." Naruto heard Tsunami call as he grimaced and swallowed away the sudden nausea. When Naruto opened his eyes again, both Inari and Tsunami were gone and Tazuna was staring at the table sadly. "Seems like there's a story here," Kakashi commented as if he didn't care. Naruto looked to his teacher and saw that Kakashi's cup of tea was already halfway empty. Just for spite, Naruto pushed his tongue through his teeth at Kakashi. How was he supposed to see underneath Kakashi's mask if the ninja was so damn sneaky? "Before I tell you about the hero, I need to tell you about the day Inari met that man." Tazuna took off his glasses and pinched the bridge of his nose where the glasses usually rested. His name was Kaiza. Naruto lifted his arms and rested his chin on his folded arms. More comfortable now, he settled in to listen to the story. "Inari had a dog named Pochi several years ago," explained Tazuna. "It was just a stray, but Inari took it in. One day, some boys were bullying him. They threw Pochi into the lake, then pushed Inari in after the dog. Inari didn't know how to swim, but Kaiza saved him and brought him home. After that, Kaiza became like a father to Inari." Naruto let his mouth form a smile. Already this sounded like a good story. It was missing a little bit of action, like someone beating on those bullies that dared to pick on someone smaller than them, but still good. "One month, we had more rain than usual," Tazuna continued. "There was a super big rainstorm, and part of the village was in danger of flooding. Kaiza dove into the rapids to tie a rope to the gate to pull it shut. He saved the village." "He sounds like a good guy," Kaoru commented quietly into the silence that followed Tazuna's pause. His hand curled around his cup of tea, but it looked just as full as when Tsunami had set it down. "He was," Tazuna responded. Naruto liked this story. The guy really was a hero. To protect your home with all your strength was what a hero did. After all, that's what ninja did, wasn't it? But then, Gadu came to this country. The old man began again. His body shivered as if a cold breeze had shot through the room. "What happened?" inquired Kakashi. He didn't sound quite so bored now, but Naruto wasn't surprised. The story was just getting good now. "In front of everyone, Gadu put Kaiza to death," Tazuna announced solemnly. Wide-eyed, Naruto stared at Tazuna and wondered if he had heard wrong. But Sakura and Sasuke both had similar shocked looks on their faces at the news that Gato had taken away so much from the small family. That wasn't supposed to happen. The hero of the story wasn't supposed to die in the end. That didn't make a happy ending. Gato accused Kaiza of committing terrorist acts against his corporation. Tazuna sighed and kept his eyes on the table instead of the shinobi watching him carefully. Kaiza, the village's hero, was called a danger to the country's peace and killed. From that day, Inari changed. As did Tsunami and the whole village. Naruto buried his chin in his arms and glared at the table. That was why Inari didn't believe in heroes. It was because his hero had died for what he believed. But Inari still cried for him. Naruto's brows came together swiftly. Konoha had heroes, too. Iruka-sensei had saved Naruto from that ass Mizuki. And Yondaime had died for his village. To save it from Kyuubi. That was what Naruto wanted to be. Not that he necessarily wanted to die. But he wanted to be a hero. He was going to be a hero. Naruto planted his palms on the table and pushed off firmly, but as soon as he stood, his legs felt like jelly and refused to support his weight. He managed to turn his body so that he fell on his shoulder instead of his still full stomach. But his grunt attracted everyone's attention. "Naruto, what are you doing?" demanded Sakura. "If you're thinking of training, don't," commanded Kakashi bluntly. "You've already used up too much chakra today. If you release any more, you'll be in danger of chakra exhaustion." Naruto gritted his teeth and pushed himself up off the floor. "I'm going to prove it," he murmured. "What?" Sasuke demanded, and Naruto was almost too determined to get out the door to notice that the bastard hadn't even called him a name. "I'm going to prove that heroes still exist in this world," declared the blonde. "You want help, Gaki?" called Kaoru. "Nope." Naruto frowned over his shoulder then softened his look. His cousin was cool, but Naruto had to do this on his own. "I had to prove it." Kaoru stared at the boy for a moment with that intense look that always reminded Naruto of standing in front of Iruka-sensei waiting to hear if he had failed again. Apparently, Naruto passed because Kaoru nodded once as a corner of his mouth turned up slightly. Satisfied, Naruto smiled back then marched out the door. Chapter 13. Haku raised his free hand and ran his long, slender fingers through the dark locks to smooth the kinks out. He had already dressed in a simple kimono with a plain obi and the traditional geta. His outfit in addition to his feminine looks ensured that he would not be perceived as a threat while on his outing in the forest surrounding the small village with its half-completed bridge. The basket he carried bore only a handful of the herbs he was looking for, plus a few he had found that were good for combating fever. Zabuza-sama showed no signs of infection, and the wounds that Haku had not inflicted himself had been small. Still, it helped to be prepared. Their next job might include some wounds that would need more serious attention than simply a week of bed rest. Haku smiled at the bird that perched on his shoulder. Animals had always been attracted to him, even during the short summers in the village of his birth. Briefly, Haku wondered if he would be able to build a cage or two for the birds in order to take them with him when he and Zabuza left. The rabbit that Haku had cared for had been needed for the sake of the mission. Granted, it had only spent a few weeks in a cage, being carried around by a Noog Nin and his companion, but it was enough to make the rabbit jump at the first chance of freedom it was offered when the Konoha Nin discovered it then quickly released it. A sudden tingling at the back of Haku's neck, a sensation that he shared the forest with more than merely the birds, caused Haku to tense with alertness. A sharp jerk of his head dislodged the bird on his shoulder, and Haku's eyes fell on a splash of orange that looked severely out of place on the forest floor. A boy lay on his back amidst the foliage under a tree. The birds didn't seem to mind the intrusion as they perched on the boy's fingers and chest without waking the sleeping figure. Then, a glint of metal caught Haku's eye. The symbol for konohagakure shone brightly from the thin, bright hide-8 that rested on the boy's forehead, and Haku recognized his enemy. He was the one who had driven a kunai into Zabuza-sama's bunshin, the loudest of all the Konoha shinobi. Haku's eyes narrowed for a brief moment. Then he walked gracefully up to the boy's prone form, still oblivious in sleep, and stretched out one hand. "Hey, wake up!" Kaoru ran his left thumb over the palm of his right hand. The symbol on his palm didn't smudge, but it didn't disappear either. For a moment, Kaoru simply stared at the kanji, a copy of the symbol that Yamato-senpai had always used to suppress the Kyuubi's chakra when Uzumaki Naruto started to lose control. It was now a permanent feature of Keiru's body and chakra system. He curled his fingers into a fist, covering the seal briefly before he returned his attention to his target. The tree behind Tazuna's house was already peppered with dents and kunai, but it wasn't exactly the same kind of training as Sasuke and Naruto were currently punishing themselves to master. Keiru flipped another kunai from his pouch into his right hand and gently called on the familiar feeling of his own chakra. Then, marking the tree for death, he flipped the weapon into the bark of the tree. The blade sunk halfway into the wood of the tree, a little less than Keiru was hoping for. "Where's the dobi?" The cold demand came from the house behind Keiru, but he didn't bother to turn around as he snagged another kunai from his pouch. "I know of no one by such a name, Teme," he answered Sasuke playfully and flicked his wrist to drive the chakra-loaded kunai into the tree. Naruto. Kaoru looked over his shoulder at the second voice. He didn't know Sakura had been watching him as well. The girl had her hands clasped in front of her dress and chewed on her lip worriedly. Did he stay out all night training again? Inquired the sole kunoichi on the team. Seems that way. Kaoru gave her a sympathetic smile. It wasn't her fault she got stuck with such stubborn-headed teammates. It had been nearly a full week since their encounter with Zabuza on the road had left Kakashi injured and Zabuza debilitated. Naruto had spent every night since hearing of Inari's father out in the woods training until he was too tired to do anything but drag himself back to Tazuna's house to eat, sleep, then repeat the process after breakfast. Kaoru couldn't fault the boy. After all, Kaoru was doing pretty much the same thing. Staring at the kunai in his hand, Kaoru dismissed thoughts of climbing trees for his own goal of piercing one. He had been working on his own version of the training exercise Sarutobi Asuma had once taught him for the past 2 days. He only channeled a minute amount of chakra into each kunai, just enough to give it more of an edge but not enough to cause any pain to his seals, even after a full day of the exercise. When the blade in his hand glowed with a covering of pale blue, Kaoru hurled the weapon at the tree. Like all the others, the blade buried itself in the tree to the hilt and halted its advance there. Sasuke scoffed quietly, and Kaoru snapped his head over his shoulder with a frown. He was trying hard enough to figure out how to fight without killing himself without the 12-year-old jerk making any comments. Sasuke held Kaoru's gaze for a moment, just long enough to remind Kaoru that Sasuke, though still a jerk, was still also 12. He was a kid, and he wasn't the same as the last time Kaoru had seen his friend. Shaking his head, Kaoru looked back to his tree and studied his previous attempts. Naruto's going to kill himself this way, Sasuke called from behind the redhead. Kaoru wasn't sure if Sasuke was deliberately ignoring Kaoru's weird behavior, namely his inability to hold a frown for longer than 30 seconds, or just dismissing it as an insanity that could well have been a trait in all Uzumaki. Still, it was a protest that required a response. Nah. Kaoru smirked and walked up to the tree. He'll probably outlive everyone only to get killed by a couple bandits on the road. His shoulders shook with the effort, but Kaoru managed not to laugh. He didn't want to have to explain exactly why his inside joke was so funny. Kaoru grabbed a kunai halfway up the trunk. It was left over from last night and hadn't been embedded into the wood quite as deep, thus easy to pull out. But didn't he even come into sleep last night? Sakura asked worriedly as Kaoru returned to his spot. No, the older genin answered shortly. Kaoru frowned at the tree, but more at Sakura's question than his opponent of wood. He had checked Naruto's bedroll that morning before he came out. It hadn't been slept in. The fact in and of itself wasn't really worrying. Naruto always had a hell of an immune system, and there was little risk of him getting sick from exposure to the night air or using up too much chakra. The fox would be hard-pressed to allow either. Missing nin, on the other hand, were a little bit harder to predict. Kaoru drew on the chakra reserves he knew were still in his body and pumped his kunai full of as much of his own wind-natured chakra as he dared without some the more tainted chakra that his seals were supposed to keep back. His eyes zeroed in on his target, and he let the blade soar. The shinobi knife pierced the kunai-peppered tree and tore through a second tree behind it before it sunk into a thicker, older tree, 8 meters behind Kaoru's original target. Kaoru craned his neck to judge the distance between his one success and the tree he had limited himself to for the past 2 days. A tingling sensation traveled from his right shoulder all the way to the tips of his fingers, a sharp burning like someone had pinched all the nerves in his arm, and reminded him exactly why he had been holding back. Kaoru's hand slipped into his pocket to fetch the glove that usually covered the seal on his palm. He tugged it on quickly, deciding that the kunai could wait a few hours to be collected. I'm gonna go look for Naruto, Kaoru announced and started into the forest where he knew Naruto would be. With mission, there were too many variables this time. He wanted to think that Haku would never kill anyone he didn't have to. He certainly hadn't killed Sasuke that first time when he had every opportunity. But could anyone be trusted to remain as they always had been when Kaoru himself had changed so much? Kaoru cricked his head over his shoulder and glanced back at the dark-haired boy who was still staring at him in clear suspicion. Ya comin' or stayin', Uchiha? Kaoru demanded with a smirk. The suspicion was unnerving, but the annoyed frown at being caught in a mood other than, I am better than you and everyone knows it, was a little more familiar. Kaoru paused just long enough to let Sasuke make up his mind. Together they tramped into the woods in search of a wayward teammate. And Kaoru suspected that some changes just might be for the good in the long run. Maybe even the short. Hey, is this the stuff you wanted? Naruto demanded, holding a thin, green stalk delicately between 2 fingers. Yes, the visitor answered with a smile. The kid wore a plain kimono and had long dark hair, even longer than Sakura-chan's. His guest had woken Naruto up where he had plopped down last night, too exhausted even to drag himself back to Tazuna's house where he had a mattress waiting for him. As far as he was concerned, the forest floor was plenty comfortable for a short rest before he started again. Thank you for helping me. Naruto broke off thoughts of chakra and tree climbing to grin at his new acquaintance. No problem. He waved off the thanks with a nonchalant hand. Whoever you're gathering these for must need them. She said she had been in the forest to collect herbs for a sick friend. Naruto knew being sick was no fun, and the girl was pretty anyway, so like a good hero he agreed to help her out. Why are you out here so early? Asked the soft voice. Training, Naruto replied immediately. You have a Hite 8, the older kid noted. You're a ninja? You noticed? Naruto beamed at the wide dark eyes that gazed back at him. Yeah, I'm a ninja of Konoha. He wondered if there was something about him that let people know that he was shinobi. Besides the forehead protector, of course. But Karu Ni had him pointing out off-duty shinobi, and Naruto was getting pretty good at it. That meant that there was something about a ninja that set them apart from everyone else. Naruto hoped that he could have that someday, preferably soon. Why are you training? So that I can become stronger, was the immediate answer. Everything hinged on becoming stronger. You already look pretty strong, commented the girl. Why? Naruto sat up a little straighter as she trailed off, her sentence lingering between them unfinished. This was going good. First the girl could tell that he was a ninja just by looking, and now she could tell that he was strong. Not quite strong enough, though. I need to become the strongest ninja in my village so that everyone will have to acknowledge me, explained Naruto. If he was strong, then people would stop looking at him with such hatred in their eyes. Like Karuni said, it would get better. Besides, there was still the mission to consider, since Konoha never backed down from a mission. And that kid was still crying over something that Naruto understood better than the kid thought. And also, Naruto began in a softer voice, I need to prove something to someone. To someone else, then? His companion cocked her head in a curious manner, which made Naruto frown at the strange behavior. The girl let out a soft giggle, and Naruto's face became even more confused. Girls were weird. Do you have someone who is precious to you? Inquired the dark-haired girl. It was Naruto's turn to cock his head as he puzzled the stranger's meaning. A person could be precious. When a person has something precious to protect, that's when they become truly strong, she explained. The contemplative look that crossed Naruto's face looked slightly out of place on one so young, but knowing no other life, Naruto didn't think of it. He was thinking of his cousin, Uzumaki Keiru, the one he wanted to protect from whatever was eating him inside out. He thought of Kakashi-sensei and Sakura-chan. Even Sasuke Teme was his friend now, a person to get strong along with. Naruto liked having someone to measure himself against, and who better than Konoha's Rookie of the Year? Not that the title really meant anything to Naruto. Yeah, Naruto nodded solemnly. Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. The kid staring at him gave him a serious look before nodding once, like Keiru sometimes did when Naruto had come up with the right answer. You will become strong. She stood up, taking her filled basket with her. Suddenly, her eyes flickered to the forest that surrounded them. Curious, Naruto followed her gaze and saw a familiar shock of red hair that made him beam, showing off nearly all the teeth in his mouth. Hey, Keiru Ni-san! Naruto shouted as he lifted one hand and waved vigorously at his cousin. Keiru smiled back with one side of his mouth going slightly higher than the other. That smile always made him look cool, and Naruto hoped he could pull that off someday. Whatcha doin', Gaki? Keiru approached Naruto and the standing girl as Sasuke emerged from behind a tree, following behind the older genin. Naruto paid him little mind. Ah, she needed some plants, explained Naruto, pointing at the girl, so I'm helping. Good, Keiru declared at his little cousin before he turned to the girl, Ohio. He gave her a dimmed smile with his greeting. Keiru was slightly taller than the girl, but she still stood straight and looked him in the eye as she bowed her head in return. I apologize, the girl murmured. I had to get back. Understandable, said Keiru, but his eyes stayed fixed on her in the way that always meant he was thinking hard about something. As the girl turned her back and started walking away, Naruto opened his mouth to suggest that his cousin actually do something. Maybe Keiru could walk the girl home or something. That was a hero thing to do, wasn't it? But then, Keiru dropped his serious look and nodded to the girl. See y'all later, he bayed at the figure's back. Naruto turned as well, a bit happier now that he realized that she probably lived in the village and he and Keiru could see her again when the mission was done, or before. Yeah, see ya, lady, Naruto called, louder than Keiru had since the girl was farther away now. When Naruto turned around to face his cousin, he caught the amused smirk on Sasuke's face. The one that he wore when he clearly thought that he was better than Naruto. Naruto immediately scowled. And it had started out as such a good morning, too. What, Teme? He demanded. Sasuke just shook his head and scoffed. Dobi. Naruto glared, not that it did much of anything to Sasuke, and raised his fist to punch the smirk off the bastard's face. That was a guy, Gaki, Keiru suddenly interjected. He looked faintly amused, as well, but the head jerk in the general direction that Naruto's morning companion had left and shocked the displeasure right out of Naruto. What? He stared in the same direction as if he could catch a glimpse of the person in question. but he's even girlier than Sakura-chan. Watch the throat, not the face, Gaki. Kaoru tapped the back of his fingers lightly against the knot of cartilage in the center of his throat, just above his windpipe. Ya hungry? Naruto barely considered the question before shaking his head emphatically. He had practically stuffed himself again the night before, and he could always eat later. He hadn't been lying about needing to get stronger. Kaoru nodded, unsurprised. Didn't think so, he muttered more to himself than the enthusiastic boy. Well, let's get going then. Kaoru started walking to a fresh tree, ignoring the one that Naruto had spent the night marking up. What do ya wanna bet you both get this mastered by the end of the day? He asked casually. You really think so, Kaoru ni? Naruto grinned, ignoring the silent brooding boy who followed them. Sure. Kaoru just shrugged then glanced down at the shorter Uzumaki. You master this today, what do you want me to pay? Ramen, Naruto shouted the first thing that came into his mind. Wave didn't have practically anything except rice and fish, and Naruto was missing his daily supplement of noodles. Next time his team had a mission outside of Konoha, he would have to make sure he packed extra ramen. Kaoru laughed loudly, briefly, and grinned. Fine, he agreed. You make it up the tree, I'll treat you to ramen when we get back to Konoha. Yosh! Naruto pumped one fist in the air and strode to a new tree, determination chasing the last remnants of distraction from his mind. At least, the last except for one last remark by his cousin. You, too. Naruto looked over his shoulder to see Kaoru staring right at an antisocial, if not confused, Uchiha. I did say both of you, Kaoru explained with his eyes still on Sasuke. Sasuke just ed loudly and turned to his own tree. Naruto wrinkled his nose at the obvious rudeness of the other boy before he set his concentration back on the tree. Even if he didn't like Kaoru, which was a sin in and of itself, who in their right mind would turn down free ramen? Kakashi limped his way deeper into the forest with Sakura at his side, just in case. His side was healing quickly despite the lack of any med nin or healing jutsu. His biggest problem currently was the mere fact that his energy was sapped. He doubted that he could pull off even a C-rank jutsu in his condition. It was annoying, but he would be back to full capacity in another day, 2 at the most. Right now, he was focused more on his students. They were all taking their duty much more seriously than he thought them capable of when he first heard their introductions on top of the Shinobi Academy. Naruto and Sasuke were staying out all day, sometimes longer, to master the chakra control exercise that he had assigned them. Sakura had been going to the bridge every day with her protection detail, and Kaoru had been splitting himself 3 ways nearly every day. Kakashi was sure that the kid's real body was the one protecting Tazuna with Sakura, but Naruto reported, in his boasting, ever-enthusiastic way, that his cousin also stuck with the 2 boys practicing the tree-climbing exercise. Plus, Kakashi had seen the red-headed genin circling Tazuna's house occasionally when he was supposedly with Tazuna and Sakura on the bridge. Kakashi had woken to quiet, a usual state of being only when Naruto was absent from the scene. He soon discovered from Sakura that Naruto had spent the night in the forest, training, and Kaoru and Sasuke had gone to look for him. After a brief once around the house, just to check for any major differences in the landscape, Kakashi agreed that the 2 of them should check on their wayward team. Sakura had been quiet during the trek through the forest, and Kakashi had been too busy looking at the trees, most of which were marked with at least 20 or so scratches at varying levels. On one tree, the marks started 2 meters up, then a tree slightly beyond that was clear until about 3 meters off the ground. The boys were obviously progressing. Sakura and Kakashi passed through a small clearing before ducking back into the speckled sunlight under the foliage before Kakashi realized they had found them. Despite his physical state, he was too used to searching for obvious chakra signatures to miss the blonde genin about 6 meters above his head. Hey, Sakura-chan! Naruto shouted, Kakashi-sensei. Kakashi cocked his head at the same time as Sakura suddenly jerked her eyes skyward. Naruto stood on a branch 3 stories from the ground, grinning down at his teammate and teacher. Naruto, called Sakura in obvious surprise. By tilting his head slightly, Kakashi caught sight of Sasuke's dark figure on another tree. The branch not even half a meter higher than Naruto's, which Kakashi guessed was intentional. But, despite the inherent rivalry between the 2, Kakashi supposed that his 2 genin would be fine. Good morning, Sasuke-kun. Sakura smiled up at the dark boy, and Kakashi knew that her attention, for the moment, was lost. Kakashi thought that he should probably do something about the girl's infatuation, at least the part that interfered with her concentration at times. But he had no idea how. His only real experience with the situation had been his own team and Rin's relationship with both her boys. But his own team had not turned out well, and whatever other legacies Hatake Kakashi could claim, he was not his sensei. Suddenly, Naruto flung his arms out and whooped wildly as his center of gravity shifted backwards. Kakashi's eye involuntarily widened when he saw his student lean back precariously. He wouldn't be fast enough to catch the boy, and in his condition, A transportation jutsu would either get him only halfway to his destination or knock him out entirely. Kakashi saw Sasuke rounding the trunk of the tree as Sakura let out an alarmed cry and hoped that his student was faster than he was. And then there was no need for Sasuke or Kakashi to do anything because Naruto was firmly attached to the underside of the branch, grinning down at his audience triumphantly. "Don't scare us like that," Sakura shouted up at the boy, then added in a softer voice, "Baka." Kakashi felt his shoulders slump at being caught in a second of Naruto's pranks while Sakura berated her teammate loudly. Then, a taller figure, mostly in red, dropped onto the branch that Naruto's feet were still glued to. "Boo," Kaoru called lightly. Kakashi hadn't thought to keep searching for Kaoru after he had sensed his two genin, so the young man's appearance was somewhat surprising but not alarming. Naruto, on the other hand, was taken by such surprise that he jumped. Which probably wasn't the best idea considering he had nothing to land on when gravity overtook chakra control. Kaoru's hand shot out and wrapped around one of Naruto's ankles, jerking him back up so that the boy hung on the branch by his knees. From the look on his face, Naruto was neither impressed by Kaoru's display of speed nor very happy at the scare his cousin had given him. Kaoru just chuckled and let Naruto hang on the branch like a kid rather than a ninja. So, Kaoru smiled widely in a way that Kakashi couldn't help but link to Naruto's previous grin. "What you think about this team, Hitaki Kakashi?" Kakashi refused to let his gaze travel obviously by any means, but his senses took their course in confirming the locations of all three genin up in the trees. Naruto and Kaoru remained poised on the same branch, upside down and right side up, while Sasuke had moved to stand horizontally on his trunk, his face settling into passive huff at the antics before him. Sakura, for her part, was simply studying the boys above her, as if confirming that they were all truly all right. And yet, despite his observations, Kakashi really felt no compelling desire to answer Kaoru's question truthfully, or at least not openly. He wasn't going to say that he was proud of his students for working so hard, especially under dire circumstances. He wasn't going to mention that he had been almost giddy when he decided that this team was the one he could pass because they actually got the idea that teammates were important. And he definitely wasn't going to reveal that this was the first team he truly cared about since he lost his own teammates under one of Konoha's strongest Hokage. But, shinobi were masters of deception, and Kakashi had made an art of appearing to be a hip, slightly perverted man who didn't really mind not having to do any work. "I think you should get down from the tree before Naruto loses the death grip he has on that branch," he replied calmly. Above him, Naruto glared past his tense muscles and white knuckles with all the indignation of a boy who was trying his best not to show any weakness. Kaoru threw back his hand and laughed again. Miraculously, Kaoru, Naruto and Sasuke to return to Tazuna's house before sunset, albeit with some coaxing and prodding. Both boys had made it to the top of the canopy after Kakashi and Sakura left, giving Kaoru silent permission to stay behind with the boys. Kaoru still had a few bunchin at the bridge, for the sake of helping the old man, but his attention was fixed on getting Naruto and Sasuke up the tree so they could go home and rest before tomorrow. If he remembered correctly, Zabuza and Haku would be making a deadly appearance pretty soon. Naruto had been reluctant to cut down on any training time, but at least he could be persuaded to annoy Kakashi into letting them all protect Tazuna as a team once again. Kakashi, who was hobbling around Tazuna's house without his crutches, agreed over supper that Naruto and Sasuke could join Sakura on the bridge since their teacher was recovered enough to supervise. Kaoru leaned back on the bench he sat on, pleased with the day's events as well as his teammates' accomplishments. Sasuke and Sakura sat across from him, finished with their meal. Sakura tried to engage her teammate in a bland conversation about rice balls and favorite flavors of umeboshi, but Sasuke wasn't being very cooperative. Naruto, having stuffed himself almost as well as that first night, folded his arms on the table in front of him and rested his head with a happy chuckle, completely satisfied with his life at the moment. Really, it never took that much to make Uzumaki Naruto happy. A slight trembling caught Kaoru's eye, and he watched the smallest boy at the table carefully, waiting. "Why do you try so hard?" Inari demanded suddenly, anger and tears making his voice crack more than it should have. "You can't win. You're just going to die." "At least I'm not like you," replied Naruto in a cold tone that sailed hot past gritted teeth. Sakura turned her head in surprise at the blonde while Kaoru couldn't help but watch Sasuke's face shift from bored into attentive. "You think it's okay to star in your own tragedy?" Naruto continued, apparently oblivious of the attention he was getting. "When your dad died for this village and your grandpa's risking his life to help it?" He glared at the kid who had tears spilling over his eyes and a shocked look on his face while Kaoru did nothing to stop him. "Go ahead and pout, then," Naruto sneered, "you big crybaby." Sakura was shocked enough to break out of her stupor and become at least a little indignant. "And Naruto," she choked out, perhaps more shocked that Naruto had been so harsh with an annoying brat than at the fact that no swear words were used in his speech. "I'm going to bed." Naruto just pushed himself away from the table and trudged upstairs without meeting anyone's eye. Inari watched Naruto's back before it disappeared in the darkness of the stairway. Then the boy clambered from the table himself and dashed outside into the dark, keeping his head down so that his tear-streaked face was hidden. "Naruto shouldn't have said that," murmured Sakura quietly. The only response to her statement was Kakashi raising from his cross-legged position on the floor and walking quietly after Inari. Kaoru wasn't sure what the purpose of the one-eyed Junin was, but he wasn't about to stop him. "The kid was being annoying," protested Sasuke in a rare sight of affirmation toward Naruto. "Still, Naruto didn't have to be so mean," Sakura replied with her eyes cast down to the table in front of her. "It hurts to lose someone," blurted Kaoru before he really knew whom he was addressing. He glanced over his shoulder at the staircase. "Hurts when you don't have anyone in the first place, too. But both of them get you the same place." Kaoru glanced up and met Sakura's wide, green eyes, noting also that Sasuke's gaze was fixed on him in a serious manner that was almost sympathetic. "It's a rule. Being alone is hell," he declared firmly. "Inari doesn't know that, not quite." Not wanting to continue the current trail of conversation, it was already bringing up too many memories Kaoru would have chosen to push to the back of his mind permanently. The redhead stood up and shoved his gloved hands into his pockets as he ascended the stairs, looking for the room that he shared with Naruto and Sasuke. He found Naruto on his bedroll, staring moodily at the wall. "Hi," Kaoru muttered softly. Naruto shifted on the mattress but didn't bother meeting his cousin's eye. Kaoru watched the young back tense, then lowered himself onto the mattress beside Naruto, facing the door instead of the wall. "I'm not gonna yell at you," he announced in an attempt to put Naruto slightly more at ease. "Crying never helped anyone," muttered the boy solemnly. "No," Kaoru agreed. "You're right." He couldn't think of anything else to say after that. Naruto was right, after all. Maybe there could have been a better way to tell Inari that, but Kaoru couldn't think of one off the top of his head. An itch on his right palm made Kaoru slip off his glove and study the mark on his palm. Still there, still unchanged. "Do you need help?" Naruto suddenly asked. The movement apparently caught his attention. "Sure." Kaoru shifted in place so that his back rested against the wall, his legs folded in front of him. "The ink's in my..." "I know." Naruto was already up and dashing across the room to retrieve the canvas pack that was Kaoru's. He lugged it back to the mattress and fished out the mixing block and brushes. "Does it hurt?" Naruto demanded as Kaoru sliced open his thumb. A wound that wouldn't even leave a scar by morning. "No," Kaoru answered truthfully. He didn't count the tingling sensation that morning since that was hardly painful. "It's weird." Naruto frowned at that even as he took up a thick brush and loaded it with bloodied ink. "What's weird? That they don't hurt." Kaoru frowned as he stared at his right palm. "I thought they were getting worse. But I spent most of yesterday and this morning using my own chakra without even touching the poison stuff." He rarely referred to Kyuubi's chakra by name, if Kyuubi could even be considered a name and not just a reference or title. He could have called it the demon's chakra. That was by far a greater generalization but still true. He just didn't like spitting out his state of being so easily, even around Naruto. "Isn't that a good thing?" postulated Naruto as he reached for Kaoru's left hand. "Hey, this one first." Kaoru held out his right hand, palm up, to Naruto. "And it's not good. I don't know what's happening to that chakra." Naruto stopped his work and glanced up at his cousin worriedly. Kaoru smirked and wiggled his fingers in Naruto's hand. "Don't worry, Gaki," he commanded lightly, "it'll get better." His smile slowly drooped as he looked back to the brush hovering over his marked skin. "Not sure how yet, but it'll get better." Haku had been quiet ever since his return that morning. Granted, Haku was usually quiet, but this seemed more contemplative than simple lack of things to say. Either way, it was starting to get on Zabuza's nerves. Especially since he was already itching to get back to work now that his muscles had basically returned to their usual strength. "We'll attack in the morning," announced the nuke nin into the silence. When the silence continued in lieu of an affirmation, Zabuza felt irritation clawing at his inner organs. "Haku." He made simply the name a demand without even asking a question. The ninja that fought alongside Hitaki Kakashi as brother to one of the genin, Haku answered with his head still bent over the plants he had picked that morning. His perch on a small stool with the shallow basket in his lap did not make him seem tall or threatening in any way. "So," Zabuza sneered. He knew the fundamental idea behind bonds, the emotions they had the power to invoke. He also made sure that he was never caught in such trappings. "I believe he will fight more fiercely if his family is in danger," replied Haku calmly. "Leave the redhead and Hitaki to me," Zabuza ground out impatiently. "Your task is to distribution, Zabuza-sama." Haku nodded then went back to his task. Zabuza turned away from the boy with a frown and studied the apple beside his bed. Haku had placed it there should his master become hungry. Even after years as Zabuza's tool, Haku was still soft. The boy could kill in the blink of an eye. Zabuza had no doubt about that, and his Kekai Genkai was a useful advantage. But Haku was the one to care for any animals they kept occasionally. Before the rabbit it had been a squirrel before Zabuza found that the animal was too small, had barely enough natural energy to sense and switch with. Haku also could convince people that he was normal and friendly to such a degree that Zabuza wondered sometimes if he was actually faking such friendliness. Haku, he called as he picked up the small fruit. I don't want any complications in this job. Kill the brats if you have to. Hi, Zabuza-sama, Haku agreed once more. Satisfied, Zabuza tightened his grip on the apple until the flesh parted in chunks beneath the claw-like vice's fingers formed. Haku may be soft but he would never go against his master. Sasuke walked outside after his morning toilet just in time to catch the end of an argument between the two Uzumaki. Then make some cage bunshin, ordered Keiru, standing in front of his shorter cousin, but either you or them are staying here. Sasuke frowned at the command as well as the tone. Keiru almost sounded like an older brother bossing around his younger counterpart, but it was far too serious and lacked the sense of superiority for that. Keiru sounded like a commander giving orders. Why? Naruto frowned in response. Cause this is Gato, and he's mean and a bully, and he won't hesitate to kill Tazuna's family if he can't get the old man. Keiru folded his arms across his chest and waited patiently for Naruto to let the words sink in. Naruto glanced over the house behind Sasuke, apparently missing the Uchiha completely in his solemnity, then looked back at his cousin. Okay, he agreed with a nod. How many? Between 2 and 5, answered Keiru. We don't want to attract too much attention. Naruto held his hands up in a cross-like hand seal and replicated himself with a murmur and a puff of smoke. Good. You remember how to patrol? Keiru the commander was back. All figures of Naruto nodded as one then broke off to circle the house where Tsunami and Inari were still sleeping. Sasuke shoved his hands in his pockets to make himself look casual and approached the two cousins. Hey, Sasuke, greeted Keiru in a rare mention of his given name. All the authority in his gaze had faded into a friendly half-smile. The others are already waiting for us. You ready? A slight jerk of Sasuke's chin acknowledged the question, and they started to the road where Sakura, Kakashi, and Tazuna were waiting. What rank did you hold before you came to Konoha? Sasuke asked bluntly. He was half expecting the answer to be, Chunin. A Chunin would know how to order subordinates around, and Keiru could hold his own at least partially against someone like Zabuza. He couldn't be Chunin, could he? Keiru seemed a little young for that title, but then Itachi had made Chunin at 10 years old, then practically skipped his way into his role as Anbu captain when he was 13. Why does everyone ask me that? Keiru threw his hands up in the air dramatically. I was Genin. I only took the Chunin exams once, and I was an idiot. Keiru shot a pointed glare at Sasuke at the end of his explanation. It didn't make Sasuke believe him anymore. What's the Chunin exams? Demanded Naruto curiously. What do you have to take to get to the next rank? Answered Keiru, much calmer now. It's usually 3 different tests you have to take, a couple with your team, but then you go through individual fights. Did you lose your fight? Naruto asked, his eyes wide. Sasuke suspected that Naruto didn't believe that his almighty older cousin could ever lose a fight, at least not one that was testing strength. No, I won. Keiru's eyes fell to the ground in front of his feet as he kicked up a small cloud of dirt. I couldn't protect my teammates. A Chunin needs to be able to do that. Keiru looked to Naruto at his final declaration, as if to impress the importance of his statement on the genin. Sasuke shook his head to get rid of the feeling that he was eavesdropping on a conversation taking place right beside his shoulder. He ignored the niggling feeling at the back of his mind that reminded him he knew the pain of not being able to protect the ones he wanted to, and that he knew exactly what being alone felt like. They met up with the other 3 on the road and started down through the village toward the great bridge that Tazuna was sure would be his country's salvation. As long as he lived to finish it. Sakura fell into step with Sasuke while Tazuna and Kakashi led the way, not talking of much of anything. Behind him, Sasuke could hear Naruto and Keiru's animated conversation and tried to forget about the times that he could see a strength in Keiru that was far beyond what he claimed.